Death by Doughnuts, previously published as The Way the Cookie Crumbles.
Ginger Burnet Cozy Mystery Series, Starter Book. Written by Clementine Moore and published by Starfall Publications. Available on our website and with an amazing offer. Enjoy.
Chapter 1. The cottage had finally stopped radiating heat, but the once pale walls were now scorched and crumbling. Inside was nothing but an empty space, a cavity bereft of all internal structure. Windows stood empty like vacant eye sockets, and the roofless building was spread open to the sky. Nonetheless, Ginger Burnet saw potential in the ruin. Tools in hand, she approached, determined to shape the sweet little cottage into the masterpiece that she knew it could be. Ginger picked up her small pot of isomalt and a teaspoon, the tip of her tongue poking out the side of her mouth. Adjusting the cool, dark brown gingerbread wool on the waxed paper, she carefully began to pour the melted sugar replacement into the spaces left for the windows. Amid her intense focus, Ginger heard the tap of tiny feet, followed by the chair on the opposite side of the table, creaking as a weight landed on it. After she finished pouring the window, Ginger looked up through her feathery brunette fringe to see Nina, one of her blue short-hair cats, peering over the edge of the table with her intense golden eyes. "Don't even think about it," Ginger warned, setting down the isomalt and lifting the setting sugar glass onto the wooden worktop, well out of reach of curious paws. "Remember what happened when you investigated the caramel? We had to clip patches of your fur off and it took weeks to grow back properly." Lifting her head above the table, Nina twitched one ear and squinted, as if reliving her mistake. Ginger chuckled, taking up one of her piping bags filled with royal icing. She continued to work on the smaller pieces of gingerbread she had cut out freehand for the hedges included in her design. Her record of a Thelonious Monk concert that he and his quartet had given in Paris in 1964 was playing on the turntable in the living room next door. As she drew delicate leaves and stalks in various hues of green and brown, Ginger found herself humming along and began to sway a little, her bare feet lightly skimming the cool ceramic tiles of her cottage's kitchen floor. It was one of her favourite records, and it never failed to get her toes tapping. "Did I ever tell you where I found this record, Nina?" she asked the cat, who was now dozing in a patch of August sunlight. "It was November, a couple of years ago before I moved back here to Little Chiswick. I was still in London, and it was dark, raining, miserable." The cat rolled onto her back, twitching one ear as she looked at Ginger upside down. "I was walking to the tube to go home one evening when I passed this little pop-up market on the Thames embankment." Ginger picked up a cocktail stick and began adding texture to the hedge leaves while the icing was still soft. There was a crate of records in a corner on the floor. Something made me stop to flick through them, and I found this masterpiece. Nina sneezed as she accidentally inhaled some flour off the floor, then leapt to her feet and trotted out of the kitchen. "Sorry, was I boring you?" Ginger called, shaking her head with a grin. Shimmying across the kitchen to check on the cooling windows in her gingerbread walls, Ginger got lost in the memory of dancing around her beautiful but tiny London flat. On that freezing November night, she'd soaked in the smooth notes of the music to try and forget about how miserable her job, her home, and her life were. Turning back toward the kitchen's central island to place the finished hedge piece with the others, Ginger had to stop with a squeak of alarm when she nearly stepped on her second blue short-hair cat. "Miles," she chastised, scooping him up, "I know you're half-blind, buddy, but please try to keep out from under my feet." The cat purred, head-butting her gently on the chin. He blinked slowly, his left eye the yellowish green of oxidized copper, the right milky white with blindness, with happiness as he snuggled closer to her. The clatter of the metal cover on the letter slot cut through the peaceful atmosphere. A moment later, Nina came trotting into the kitchen, an embossed dark green envelope held delicately in her mouth. "What do we have here?" Ginger asked, dusting off her hands on her faded jean shorts. Crouching, she delicately took the envelope from her cat's mouth, giving Nina a scratch behind the ear in thanks. Turning the envelope over in her hands, Ginger studied it carefully. The thick, expensive cardstock of the envelope was the deep green of the moss growing on her cottage's roof tiles, and was embossed with twisting vines. Most notable, however, was the ornate black wax seal pressed onto the back. Tipping it toward the light, Ginger tried to make out the letter or symbol at the centre of the seal. However, the heat of August was not friendly to wax, and the design had melted slightly. "Who sends letters with wax seals anymore?" Ginger murmured, sitting cross-legged on the floor, leaning back against the pale blue-grey doors of her kitchen cabinet. Reaching up and feeling around for the small sharp knife she'd been using previously to trim the gingerbread, Ginger slit open the top of the envelope and took out the letter inside. With a growing sense of astonishment and intrigue, she quickly scanned the lines of beautifully written calligraphy, one hand coming up to cover her mouth in surprise. "Miles, Nina, listen to this." "Dear Miss Burnet," she read aloud, "here at Breakline Entertainment, we're always eager to find new ways to push the borders of local programming and believe that even local television stations can host unique, high-quality programming. So, we've decided this year to take steps toward making this a reality with reality." Ginger paused to chuckle a bit. She'd written enough marketing copy in her previous London life to see how much effort had gone into making this letter appear off the cuff and funny. "We know that the true strength of local programming is the local people," she continued reading, stroking Miles, as he climbed onto her thigh in search of affection. "And so, we've gone in search of the undiscovered stars of Gloucestershire. You are one of those stars." She tapped Miles on the nose. "Did you hear that? I'm an undiscovered star." Miles sneezed on her hand. Ginger gave a long-suffering sigh and returned to the letter, wiping her hand off on her jeans. "Our talent scouts here at Breakline Entertainment found the mind-blowing baking talent you show on your social media absolutely amazing. We're certain that your skills, as well as your looks, will test well with audiences. After finding out that you have also competed in several local baking contests and done rather well, we decided that you were a perfect contestant for our new baking and mystery-themed reality show." Ginger got to her feet and wandered over to the wooden kitchen table where she'd left her laptop. There were many red flags in the letter. She was concerned it was a scam. However, a brief search showed that Breakline Entertainment was a legitimate media company operating in Gloucestershire that produced genre-defying reality shows using local talent. Satisfied, she returned to the letter, moving over to the details. Using the same kind of over-enthusiastic, peppy language, the letter detailed that the concept was a new one, and that this was an opportunity for her to be part of an exciting new pilot. The concept combined aspects of a murder mystery dinner party, an event which Ginger had always wanted to experience, never having had the chance to, and a baking challenge show in the vein of the Great British Bake Off. Filming will take place at Arlington Manor this coming Saturday and Sunday, with the contestants arriving Friday afternoon and leaving Monday morning. Ginger frowned. "This weekend? It's Tuesday. That's short notice." Nina meowed in agreement as she wandered into the living room. "But it says the winner gets a cash prize as well as free publicity for their out baking through the show," Ginger called after the cat. "And God knows I could use both, especially the cash." She slumped back in the creaking wooden chair, only half reading the final few lines filled with corporate babble about how she can't discuss this opportunity with others due to copyright laws, and that she has 24 hours to respond via post. It seemed like a good opportunity at first glance, even if the communication method and the guidelines were a little strange. The company was real, and she knew of Arlington Manor. It was a beautiful old manor house about an hour from the villages of Greater Chiswick and Little Chiswick where she lived, deep in the rolling hills of the Cotswolds. "It could be a chance to make a bit of a name for myself, Miles," Ginger murmured. "I know I've got that job as a cook at Chiswick Park Academy all lined up, but if I won this competition mystery thing, hell, even if I just took part in it, It might convince Mum and Colin that I wasn't insane for giving up everything in London and coming back here. Miles carefully picked his way around the kitchen island and over to the kitchen table, his trajectory skewed slightly by his blindness. However, he reached the chair where Ginger was sitting and leapt lightly into her lap, immediately beginning to purr. "Thanks, baby," Ginger murmured, taking a deep breath. Focusing on the softness of his fur under her fingers and the jazz still floating in from the turntable, she found her calm once more. "Well, I've still got a while to think about it," she said, gently setting molasses on the floor and standing up, leaving the letter on the table. "Right now, I'm on a deadline to get this gingerbread ready for the quiz, and the cottage isn't going to build itself." After putting a new record on the turntable, Ginger washed her hands and took up her piping bags again. Soon, she was lost in the music and the artistry of her creation. A soft breeze blew through the open patio doors, and Miles and Nina soaked up the sun of the summer evening, their ears occasionally flickering in response to the rise and fall of the music. Chapter 2. Later that evening, with the gingerbread cottage fully completed, Ginger carefully loaded it into her car and slowly drove the few minutes down the winding country lanes from her house to the quiet village of Little Chiswick. It was Tuesday, which meant that it was quiz night down at Stuart Mill's pub, the Fox's Den. It was one of two pubs in the tiny village of Little Chiswick. The other, called the Split Oak, was a small Tudor building that Ginger passed as she entered the village. However, she noticed that, despite the warm evening, no one was at the tables outside. Thinking no more of it, Ginger drove as slowly as she dared on the one road through Little Chiswick, not wanting any of the potholes to jostle the cottage on the back seat. Squeezing into a space in the tiny car park behind the Fox's Den, Ginger breathed a sigh of relief before getting out of the car. "You made it!" her mother Dorothy cried, hurrying out of the back door of the pub, arms spread wide to hug her daughter. Ginger grinned, submitting to her mother's exuberant greeting. Many people said that they looked very similar, and Ginger could concede that she had undoubtedly inherited her mother's wavy brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and slightly gangly limbs from Dorothy. However, the smattering of freckles across her nose, excellent eyebrows, and slightly crooked teeth were all because of her father Ian. "You won't believe what we just found out," Dorothy said as she finally ended the hug. "I've just got off the phone with Martha, and it turns out that Alistair Beck—" "Who?" Ginger asked, distracted by trying to slide the gingerbread cottage out of the car without shaking any of the surrounding biscuits, made to look like hedges, trees, and cats. "You know, Alistair, who owns the Split Oak," Dorothy said, not realising that Ginger was barely listening. "Well, Martha heard from Mrs. Cook down at the newsagent's that apparently Alistair tried to bribe one of the brewers who works here to give him the method for making Stu's bitter ale. So now no one is going to his pub. It's an official boycott. It's going in the newsletter this week and everything." "No way, really?" Ginger said half-heartedly, holding the car door open with her hip while sliding the cottage further out. "Oh, hi, Colin." "Evening, Ginger," replied Colin Ashford, his soft voice still warmed by a Jamaican accent even after 40 years in England. He stooped to avoid knocking his bald head on the pub's low door frame. "Need a hand carrying the prize in?" "Please." There were few people that Ginger would trust to carry a creation that had taken her several days to bake, construct, and decorate. Her stepfather was one of those few people. "Stu is so excited that you agreed to make the prize for this week's quiz," Dorothy said, linking her arm with Ginger's. "And I think it's so nice that you're getting to practice your hobby before you start the new job up at the school." Ginger subtly rolled her eyes at how her mother referred to baking as a hobby, even though she had to admit that technically it was true. She thought of the envelope containing her response to the mysterious competition. It was tucked into her handbag, stamped first class and ready to post. Perhaps it didn't always have to be just a hobby. The two of them followed Colin with his precious bundle into the pub. Ginger grinned, flushing, as a cheer of appreciation went up from the 30 or so people gathered inside the Fox's den. Most were grouped into quiz teams around the dark wood tables, but a few casual onlookers were relaxing into the comfortable leather upholstery of the booths that lined the edges of the pub. "Ginny, my girl, you've outdone yourself with this prize," said Stuart Mill, the owner of the Fox's Den, coming out from behind the spotless bar to give Ginger a warm hug. "Let's just hope your team doesn't make things awkward by winning the quiz, or else you'll just be taking most of it home again." "I'm sure whoever wins will be more than happy to share the cottage with everyone here," Ginger called as she headed towards her regular table. "It would probably be better if they did. The butter and sugar in this thing are at a near lethal dosage. I wouldn't mind dying if it meant I got a taste of ginger," said a blonde, slightly balding man in one of the booths as he took a sip of his pint. "That's my daughter, Gary," Colin warned as he passed by the booth. "Watch your mouth." Ginger just laughed as she took a seat. "I used to work in the Indian takeaway on the corner of Price's Road when I was a teenager. I know how weak your spice tolerance is, Gary, so I'd suggest quieting down." Those listening laughed and Gary scowled, sinking deeper into the bench of the booth. "Is that the melodious sound of gin shutting down grubby Gary that I hear?" Ginger turned in her chair towards the front entrance, a grin on her face as she heard the cheerful voice of her friend Bonnie Nat. "I'm not grubby," Gary protested. "Your mind is, Gary," Bonnie said, tossing him a wink as she took a seat at the table. Gary scoffed. "Stu, are you going to let us speak to one of your customers like that?" "Stop whining and drink your beer, Gary," Stuart said, carrying a tray of dripping pint glasses over to Ginger's table. "You're a star, Stu," Dorothy said, lifting the glasses off the tray and setting one down in front of each person. Bonnie's girlfriend Mariah was the last one to arrive at the table, immediately taking a sip of her partner's cider. "The cottage looks amazing, Gin," she said, ruffling Bonnie's short white auburn hair before giving her a swift kiss. "Even better in person than it did on Instagram." Ginger blushed, not mentioning that she'd worked extra hard on the posts now that she knew companies like Breakline Entertainment were viewing her social media. "We're just about to start," Stuart said at the front of the room. "So, gather your notebooks and pencils, turn off your phones so there's no cheating, and get ready to compete for this edible piece of art that Ginger Burnet so kindly provided for us." "It looks almost professional, Gin," Colin said approvingly, nodding towards the house where he had placed it on the bar. "Not bad for an amateur." Although meant as a compliment, Ginger couldn't help but wince internally at her stepfather's observation. As the quiz began, she found herself mentally checking out, reflecting on why she so often found herself facing the same problem. Good, but not quite good enough. Ginger often felt as if that was the cursed mantra of her life. She had done well in school, but not quite good enough to get into her preferred university. She had been good enough for her previous boyfriend for the last 3 years, but not good enough for him to propose and have a life with her. It had been the same with her job, good enough to be hired and kept on for 5 years, but always passed over for promotion no matter how hard she tried. "Here, you might know these ones, Gin," Dorothy said, pushing a sheet of paper towards her daughter. "Picture round." Blinking free of her thoughts, Ginger began trying to identify the variety of beer labels from the low-resolution images spread unevenly across the page. But her mind wasn't in it, and she quickly allowed Bonnie and Mariah to take over the challenge. Ginger couldn't stop thinking about the letter waiting patiently in her bag. She didn't want baking to be another thing that she was almost good at. She wanted to prove to everyone that this was something she was genuinely skilled at. The letter, and by extension the competition, was a chance for her to prove that. As the scores for the picture round were announced, a cheer went up from the table next to hers, startling Ginger. "We've got to do better," Bonnie said, doodling moodily on the back of the answer sheet. Of course, since she was the art teacher at Chiswick Park Academy, where Ginger would be working in just a few days, her doodles were impressive still. Life's captured in an instant. "Just stay focused," Colin said calmly, finishing his glass of cider. "Anyone want another drink before Stu starts the next round?" Everyone apart from Ginger did. Bonnie offered to buy the round and joined Colin at the bar, while Mariah and Dorothy both nipped off to the loo. Left alone, still sipping her first pint, Ginger pondered whether she should break the NDA and talk to her family and friends about the opportunity. There was a part of her that was still uneasy about the whole thing, and not just because of the NDA. As much as she wanted to ask those around her for advice, she couldn't help but be afraid that they would discourage her from entering. She could already hear her mother saying how it would be too much pressure for her after such a challenging year full of stress and grief and change. Colin would nod, his dark brown eyes soft with concern, and say that she had no real experience outside of her own kitchen, although she was good at baking. If she didn't win, she might be discouraged from continuing with her hobby, which would be a tragedy for her and everyone else. Bonnie would undoubtedly chip in to point out that the whole show would likely be about humiliation and staged fighting, like a lot of reality television. Did she really want to be a part of something like that? In some ways, Ginger knew the point she was making to herself through the medium of a hypothetical conversation made sense. Still, she couldn't stop herself from daydreaming about the possibility of winning. A cash prize and proving to be a talented baker on a TV show. It would certainly prove to others and to herself that the creative baking she did could be more than just a hobby or a passion for her. Maybe a bit of local fame would help her pick up some work making specialist cakes for parties or birthdays. "Are you all right, Ginny, my love?" Dorothy asked, returning to her seat beside her daughter. "You've been awfully quiet this evening." Ginger gave a weak smile, feeling herself lean into realising that this competition was an opportunity she couldn't afford to pass up. "I'm fine, Mum. Just a little tired. I think I'm going to go away for the weekend. Maybe check into a spa to relax before I start this new job." Ginger told herself that it was a white lie, and she only told it because she had to. Besides, once the programme came out, it would be a great surprise for her mum and Colin. Dorothy stroked her daughter's hair, tucking it back behind her ear like she used to when Ginger was a little girl. "What a good idea. It's been a difficult year for you. A weekend of pampering wouldn't be a bad idea." "Exactly," Ginger said, getting to her feet, her excitement rising as she recalled that there was a post box in the wall just over the road from the fox's den. "I just remembered. I think one of the hedge pieces from the house fell off in the car. Get on with the next round without me. I'll be right back." "All right, love," Dorothy said, gathering the empty glasses together as one of the bar staff came by to pick them up. Ginger hurried out of the door, hands immediately digging through her purse for the envelope. Heart pounding, she slipped out the back door and across the car park, following the beacon of the red postbox set into the dry stone wall. Pausing in front of the cobweb-clad door that had been there since the reign of Victoria, Ginger stared at the plain white envelope she held. It wasn't as dramatic as the letter she had received, but this one somehow felt more important. This letter was her way of seizing control of her life. Before she could talk herself out of it, Ginger slipped the letter into the postbox, finding herself almost breathless immediately after. The letter would be collected first thing the next morning and reach the address she'd been given in the first letter by the end of the next day. With a final nod of satisfaction, Ginger returned to the quiz, feeling lighter now that she'd made her choice. It was out of her hands now. Bring on the baking. Chapter 3. Ginger was balanced on a stepladder, applying wood stain to the exposed beams in the living room, when there came the familiar clatter of the post arriving. Miles and Nina paused where they were, gently play-fighting on the rug in front of the empty fireplace, ears pricking at the sound. Laying the brush across the top of the paint tin, Ginger wiped off her hands on the faded green overalls she always wore when decorating. Scampering down the ladder and rushing to the door, her heart leapt as she saw another embossed, wax-sealed green envelope waiting for her on the mat. She snatched it up, leaning back against the collection of winter coats and scarves hung up by the door, waiting for their next usage. Opening the envelope, Ginger read the letter inside, as quickly as the elegant calligraphy allowed. Her first emotion was one of exultant relief when she saw the confirmation that she, Ginger Burnet, was now officially a contestant on Breakline Media's newest reality show. A grin burst across her face, and she went dancing into the living room. "I got in," she sang to Miles and Nina, performing a few wobbly pirouettes before collapsing onto the indigo blue sofa. "I mean, I know that seemed pretty likely from the first letter, but I couldn't sleep last night, wondering if maybe they'd sent out loads of letters and only the first people to reply got picked. But I guess not, because I've been chosen." "How?" Ginger wheezed as Miles leapt up beside her, sitting very deliberately on her stomach. With a somewhat withering glance at her brother, Nina climbed up onto the back of the sofa, curling her tail around her feet as she sat elegantly on the dark blue corduroy. "Miles, get off my stomach so I can finish reading this," Ginger said, shooing the blue short hair down to sprawl across her thighs. "Now, it says that a car will come and pick me up here on Friday at 3 p.m. to take me to Arlington Manor. The rest of the afternoon and evening has been set aside for the contestants to get to know one another and for a short briefing from the director and producer about the details of the show and what to expect over the course of the weekend of filming." Nina lazily flicked out a paw to bat at her brother's tail, but Miles quickly twitched it out of reach. As Ginger kept reading, she absent-mindedly reached out to scratch Nina behind the ears, prompting a slow, rumbling purr. "The competition will begin early on Saturday morning and end Sunday at midnight," Ginger said, squinting a little to decipher the writing. "The contestants will sleep at the Manor Sunday night following the end of filming. Transport will be provided on Monday morning to return the contestants to their homes." Ginger paused, frowning. "It's kind of disconcerting that they know where I live," she said to the cats. "Guess I really should have listened to Ryan about social media privacy." Her brother, who went by Ryan to avoid using his proper name, Valerian, was a detective with the local police force. He was currently involved with a complicated case involving cybersecurity that was connected to a woman who had allegedly murdered her boyfriend. He'd only mentioned the case in passing, but as Ginger remembered the things that the cybercrime unit had told him about internet safety, she grimaced. "Remind me to check over what info I have visible on my public accounts," she said to Miles. Seemingly offended at being asked to take on such a responsibility, Miles sprang to his feet, making Ginger wince as he used her body as a springboard to leap over the back of the sofa. The action sent Nina into a burst of motion. Soon, the two of them were zooming out of the living room, through the kitchen, and out the open back door to hunt one another in the tangled garden that Ginger was unsuccessfully fighting to get under control. Rolling her eyes, Ginger got to her feet more slowly and, continuing to read, headed upstairs to dig out her suitcase. Climbing the narrow wooden staircase, out of habit, she skipped the treads that squeaked the most. Reaching the upstairs landing, she used one foot to straighten the rug laid over the pale honeyed wood of the cottage's original floorboards. "Please bring all necessary personal items needed for 3 days, such as clothes and toiletries," Ginger read, leaning against the doorframe of her bedroom. "Also, bring any specialist tools required for your baking, but all other equipment and ingredients will be supplied by the production." Guess I'll need to gather all my sculpting tools and art supplies then. Who knows what we'll be making for the baking challenges? Dropping the letter among her jewellery, hair ties and incense burner scattered on top of the polished walnut chest of drawers that she used as a dressing table, Ginger crawled under her Victorian cast-iron bed in search of her suitcase. Pushing aside random bags full of gift wrappings, boxes of tea lights, and a stack of books she'd been meaning to take to charity for the last 6 months, the suitcase finally emerged victorious. Brushing the dust from the front of her overalls, Ginger sneezed, prompting 2 distinct polite meows, blessing her from downstairs. "Thank you," she called, brushing the loose strands of her long hair back out of her face and picking up the letter once more to finish reading under her breath. "Accommodation and meals will be provided. You must grant permission to be filmed, blah, blah, blah. Confidentiality agreements, legal jargon, blah, blah, blah. Oh. She stopped, rereading the sentence. Communication would be extremely limited due to the lack of phone signal in the area, and also to avoid contestants sharing confidential information. That's a little concerning. There came a clatter from downstairs, followed by a yowl, reminding Ginger that she had left the tin of wood stain open on the ladder. Swearing, she bolted down the stairs, nearly crashing into the wall at the bottom, and swung around into the living room. The tin was thankfully still balanced on the ladder, but Nina was standing on the next step down, guiltily looking at the paintbrush she had knocked away, and her brother, who now sported a long, dark streak of stain on his side. Ginger sighed, quickly putting the lid on the tin and moving it to the floor. "Come on, Miles," she coaxed, scooping up the unhappy cat. "We'll get you all cleaned up." As she ran a small bath, reflecting that she was lucky to have cats who loved the water, Ginger repeatedly thought about the section in the letter about lack of communication. "I wouldn't call myself addicted to social media or anything," she said to Miles as she gently washed the stain from his coat. "But I'd have to be stupid not to be a little worried about going off to a manor house for the weekend without telling anyone, and also not being able to communicate with the outside while I'm there." He mewed in response, lapping at the few drops of water still falling from the tap. "Exactly," Ginger said. "Even if it's not life-threatening or anything, it certainly leaves us contestants open to manipulation by the production company." She carefully poured water over Miles's back. "Maybe I should take some kind of recording equipment with me," she mused. "I'm sure I can get some kind of small body cam or something by Friday. The magic of Amazon Prime." Nina, who was perched on the toilet seat watching, gave a little chirp. "Well, of course I'm still going," Ginger replied. "This whole thing is far too mysterious and exciting to ignore. A murder mystery-themed baking challenge that might be released on TV? I'd have to be crazy to pass that up. And I'm going into it with a healthy dose of caution, so that should help." Miles meowed again, shaking the water from his head. "I'll be fine," Ginger assured him, lifting the dripping cat out of the bath and swaddling him in a towel. "And I'll make sure Mr. O'Malley from next door comes round to feed you while I'm gone." Miles snuggled under her chin, purring in contentment as the Ginger rocked him back and forth. Nina wound around her legs briefly, then scampered back downstairs. "Now," Ginger said to Miles, bopping him on the nose, "let's get you dry and then you can watch me while I pack, Chapter 4. Friday afternoon arrived, and by 3 p.m, Ginger was waiting outside the hip-height garden gate that separated the front lawn of her cottage from the tiny, one-lane road that was the only route into Little Chiswick. Spinning the small blue suitcase by her side on one wheel, Ginger couldn't stop checking her phone incessantly to see how much time had passed. She'd been standing by the gate, ready to go since 2:50. It was now 10 past the hour. The August sun was oppressively hot, and Ginger's floral print sundress was starting to stick to her back.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
Taking off her straw hat, Ginger fanned her face, staring out over the rippling golden miles of wheat and barley fields opposite her home that stretched out as far as the eye could see. The hawthorn and hazel hedges lining the lane were stuffed with white puffs of cow parsley, tangling cleavers, and pink spears of rosebay willow herb. The flowers attracted hordes of butterflies and large, fuzzy bumblebees who filled the air with their ponderous buzzing. These idyllic Gloucestershire summer days were what she had missed living in London, Ginger thought, taking a deep breath of the fresh air tinged just slightly with the scent of the hayfield to the left of her cottage. Lost in the moment, Ginger jumped when her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she momentarily panicked that the whole competition had been a prank and that no one was coming to get her. However, it was only a text from her mum telling her to have a nice weekend away in Bath, and for Ginger to text her when she arrived safely. "Will do, Mum," she texted back. "Though the coverage isn't very good at the place where I'm staying. Might not be able to call or text when I'm there, so don't worry if you don't hear from me." Just as she finished the text, Ginger heard the low rumble of an approaching car. Peering down the lane along the row of cottages, of which hers was the last, Ginger saw a large black shuttle bus with tinted windows creeping between the hedges. "I guess they're either lost or this is my ride," Ginger muttered, turning to wave one last time at Miles and Nina, where they were lounging on the windowsill of the front room. "Don't worry about them," came the reedy voice of her sweet, elderly neighbour, Mr. O'Malley. He was tending the rose bushes in his front garden and lifted a hand in a wave. "I'll make sure those little rascals come home and get fed every evening. You enjoy yourself." "You're an angel, John," Ginger called, blowing him a kiss as the shuttle stopped in front of her gate. Considering how fancy the car was, Ginger expected the driver to step out and take her bag, but nothing of the sort happened. She couldn't even see the driver through the darkened windows. Instead, the side door slid open automatically, accompanied by a sharp beeping, revealing two other women already inside, strapped into the luxurious bench seats along the edge of the bus. One, a sparrow-like older woman with only a hint of brown remaining in her carefully curled grey hair, was familiar to Ginger. "I think I know you," Ginger said as she climbed into the shuttle, setting her suitcase in front of her. "Are you Susan Ford? I think we both provided cakes for the charity fete in Worthington a few weeks ago." The woman's face brightened and she reached out a hand for Ginger to shake. "I thought I recognised you," Susan said warmly. "Ginger, isn't it? You made the 5-tier chocolate cake decorated to look like Cooper's Hill?" "Complete with rolling cheeses." Ginger grinned as she remembered one of her more insane designs. She fastened her seatbelt as the door slid closed on its own. A solid divider separated the seats from the driver's area, leaving Ginger none the wiser about who was transporting them or how long the journey would take. "I'm sorry, but why would there be cheese rolling down a hill? Am I misunderstanding something?" The question, said in a soft Scottish accent, came from the other woman in the shuttle. She was younger than Susan, closer to Ginger's age, or perhaps even younger, with an adorably chubby face, dark brown eyes, and straight black hair that fell to her shoulders. "I'm Maggie, by the way," she said quickly, waving to Ginger as they were too far apart to shake hands. "Maggie McFelder. I'm from Scotland, obviously, but I've lived over in Stratford-upon-Avon for the last few years. Anyway, back to cheese." "No, you didn't misunderstand," Susan assured Maggie. "Cheese rolling is an actual tradition around here." "It's completely insane," Ginger added. "People gather at a place called Cooper's Hill near Cheltenham, which is terrifyingly steep, and they roll huge wheels of cheese down it. The really crazy part is that people then run down that very steep hill to try and catch the cheese. People break legs and all sorts," Susan said, reaching up to fiddle with the hearing aid she had in one ear. "One of my grandsons dislocated his shoulder trying to do the run." Maggie shook her head, laughing. "My dad is Scottish. My mum's Filipino. They both warned me that English people are weird, but even though I've lived here for years now, I'm still caught off guard sometimes." Ginger laughed. "Some of the traditions around here are certainly weird, but I guess everywhere has stuff like that, right?" Maggie shrugged. "My da follows Scottish tradition and recites Burns' address to a haggis every year on Hogmanay, so you've got a point." "Do you know how much longer the drive will be, Maggie, my dear?" Susan asked. "I'm not usually in a car for this long, and my dodgy hip is starting to protest." "Is there some way we can ask the driver?" Ginger asked. "Maybe they could stop at some services so you can stretch your legs, Susan." "I think the leaflet says it's not too much longer," Maggie said, picking up a trifold from off the seat beside her. "Says there are going to be 4 stops. Ginger was the 3rd, so we've only got one more. Then it's only about 20 minutes or so to the manor. Will you be all right until then?" "Oh, yes, I'll be just fine," Susan said with a small smile. "I'll just need to make sure I get a good night's rest before the competition starts tomorrow." She was the picture-perfect grandma figure, and Ginger felt her heart melting like a marshmallow. It was difficult to think of Susan as a rival when all Ginger wanted to do was make her a cup of tea. "I still can't believe I'm going to be part of a TV show," Maggie said, shaking her head. Ginger noticed that the other woman had a nose stud made to look like a tiny strawberry cupcake, and she couldn't help but smile. "It's kind of unbelievable, isn't it?" Ginger said. "This time last year I lived in London, in a job that I hated. Now I'm on my way to be part of a mystery-themed baking reality show. Who would have seen that coming?" The three women fell into easy chatter, although Ginger couldn't help but glance toward the solid divider every once in a while, wondering about the driver on the other side. Why keep them separate from the passengers? Was it to keep the sense of excitement and mystery? Or was it more to do with keeping the details of the production private? After about half an hour of driving, the shuttle stopped again outside a neat, semi-detached red brick house. The door slid open once more, revealing a short, somewhat stout black man with neatly combed white hair. He was dressed in crisply ironed white linen trousers, a bright pink shirt, and a bow tie patterned with tiny flamingos. "Well, good afternoon, ladies," he said as he climbed into the shuttle, a small brown leather overnight bag in hand. "Charles Mathers, pleased to meet you all." The door closed and the shuttle moved off again on the final leg of the journey toward Arlington Manor. Small talk soon evolved into a discussion about baking skills and favourite recipes. Still, Ginger noticed that each of them seemed to be holding back slightly, not revealing their full capabilities or giving too many details about past baking projects. After about 20 minutes, Ginger noticed that the shuttle turned onto a road marked private. Thick copses of trees lined both sides of the road, the top branches stretching to tangle with one another, creating a dark green tunnel. The conversation slowly trailed off as everyone began looking out of the windows, sensing that the journey was coming to an end. There was a brief pause as the shuttle stopped, followed by a mechanical creak. As the shuttle drove on, Ginger saw that they had passed through two ornate cast-iron gates that slowly slid closed behind them. It seemed they had arrived at Arlington Manor. Chapter 5. The shuttle came to a stop after winding its way up a long gravel drive. Ginger guessed the drive was easily half a mile long, coiling its way through an unkempt swathe of lawn dotted with untrimmed trees and abandoned flower beds. Looking out further, all that surrounded the house was rolling fields and woods. "No wonder they said the signal out here is bad," Maggie said, tapping pointlessly at her phone. "I bet the production will have had to bring their own internet out with them. An old house in the middle of nowhere isn't likely to have fibre optic broadband." "Not a problem for me," Charles boasted, pulling an ancient Nokia phone out of his pocket. "Don't need any of that newfangled nonsense. All I need a phone for is calls." Ginger and Maggie shared an amused look as Charles continued needlessly explaining to Susan the value of a traditional mobile phone. The shuttle came to a smooth stop, and the door slid open to allow them all to exit. Ginger, who was closest to the door, stepped out first, offering her hand to both Charles and Susan to help them down the small step out of the shuttle. Once all four of them stood on the weed-studded gravel in front of the manor, their bags at their feet, the shuttle immediately drove away. As Ginger watched the vehicle disappear through the gates at the bottom of the drive, an involuntary shudder rippled through her. She told herself that it was just excitement and a few nerves, or maybe the fact that the sky had darkened with clouds, casting the world into shadow. "We seem to have arrived just in time," Charles puffed, pointing up at the sky. "A summer storm is on its way." No one looked particularly worried as they wandered towards the two large wooden doors that marked the entrance. Ginger hung back for a moment longer, looking up at Arlington Manor. She'd searched for photos of the place online the day before, having a vague memory of visiting once as a child for a school art show. The large, slightly grimy-looking building in front of her looked very different from the pictures of the idyllic, white-painted manor that had looked like it was straight out of a Jane Austen novel. Now, the white paint was studded with peeling patches, and ivy was slowly consuming one wall. Weeds were growing in the gutters, and the exposed Cotswold stone was stained with lichen. However, the windows all looked brand new, with freshly painted frames, and a bundle of cables crawled through a freshly drilled hole in the wall, suggesting that some kind of major renovation was partially underway. Large, heavy drops of rain began to plummet from the sky, urging Ginger to step inside. Her assumption about renovation was confirmed when Ginger stepped into the entrance hall. The black and white flagstones had recently been cleaned, and the walls, half wainscoted with dark cherry wood, were all freshly painted in a soft, pleasant green. What was very out of place, however, was the floor-to-ceiling glass wall dividing the foyer in half. There was a single door in the centre, closed by an intimidating steel lock and handle. The only other aspect of the smooth surface was a small container, like a letterbox, also made of glass. Wow, this all got very modern all of a sudden, Maggie said, rapping her knuckles against the wall. Don't think it's glass. Some kind of reinforced plastic, maybe? Whatever it is, it's a bold design choice. Look at the sign, Ginger said, pointing to the small laser-cut plaque above the slot of the box. Please deposit phones into this container, Charles read. They will be checked by production staff and then returned to you at the briefing this evening, once the NDAs have been signed by all contestants. His confidence and intonation reminded Ginger of a teacher or an actor, definitely someone who was used to speaking in front of others. He'd mentioned on the drive there that he was retired, but maybe his job beforehand had been something in theatre or teaching. Wow, that sounds very reasonable, Susan said, taking out her little phone and dropping it into the box. Charles did the same, and after a moment of hesitation, Maggie did the same. Ginger hung back, chewing on her lip as she typed out a text for the family group chat. Have arrived at the manor safely. Won't have my phone close by for a while, but we'll get in touch later. Love you. It's slightly strange we haven't been greeted by a production coordinator, Maggie said as her phone thunked into the box. I work backstage at a theatre, and we always have a production assistant or someone ready to greet new cast or guests. Maybe it's to heighten the sense of mystery, Charles said, his dark brown eyes lively with excitement. I mean, it's all very Hill House, isn't it? This beautiful old house, all fitted out in dark wood and original floors, with the low lighting casting everything into shadow. What better way to build an atmosphere for the mystery part of the show than to immerse us in it from the moment we arrive? You wouldn't happen to have worked in theatre at some point in your life? Maggie asked. Why, yes, Charles said, sounding surprised. I was an English, literature and drama teacher for many years. Ginger turned away to hide her grin, amused that she and Maggie had both so quickly reached similar conclusions. Her smile quickly dropped, however, when she saw that her text had failed to send. Moving closer to the door, the only thing separating her from the thunderous pounding of the rain, she held up her phone, searching for some scrap of signal. Finally, in the far corner near the window, there seemed to be just enough signal for the text to send, though Ginger couldn't be sure. I think all 4 phones need to be in the box for the door to open, Maggie said, subtly hinting that they were now all waiting on Ginger. Oh, of course. Sorry, Ginger said, dropping her phone into the box. As if by magic, the door swung open with an almost inaudible mechanical hum. Charles led the way through, but Ginger noticed that Maggie had a look of hesitation on her face that matched what Ginger herself was feeling. I can't help but feel like we're walking into a series of smaller and smaller boxes, Maggie admitted, hovering in front of the open door. I guess I'm just being paranoid, right? Right, Ginger agreed quickly, even though her gut questioned her response. I'm sure it's just nerves about being filmed. Maggie nodded, a tight smile on her face, then stepped through the door. Ginger followed, and the door immediately closed behind them. The click of the locking mechanism echoed off the stone floor, bouncing up to hang from the ceiling like a bat. Once through the door, however, some of Ginger's worries were assuaged. On this side of the barrier, it looked much more like what she'd imagined a film set would look like. There were professional lights grouped in corners, looking like troops waiting to be assigned a position. Bundles of cables slithered along the skirting boards, disappearing under doors or into power sources. Tape markers sprouted from the floor like strange fungus in blue, red, green, and yellow. There were still no people in sight, though, giving Ginger the feeling that everything was holding its breath, poised on the edge of some frenetic burst of action. She found her shoulders curling up towards her ears, and she began cracking her knuckles compulsively, a nervous tic she'd had since her teenage years. "I don't know if I agree with Charles's idea that the lack of people is for atmosphere," Maggie muttered, quietly enough that only Ginger would hear. "This just smacks of a disorganised production to me." "I think I hear voices this way," Charles announced. He'd clearly elected himself the head of the group, striding ahead with posture like a military man. "I'd have hated to have been in his class at school," Ginger said to Maggie. "He's got a lot of passion, but he doesn't seem like the type to let any shenanigans go on." And that was half the fun of drama class. "Do you suppose there will be anyone to take our bags?" Susan said softly on Ginger's other side. "Mine is really getting quite heavy." Ginger startled slightly. The other woman had been so quiet, she hadn't realised that Susan was there. "I can take it for you if you need," Ginger offered, reaching for the bag Susan carried in both hands. "I'm sure we'll see someone from the production team soon." "Thank you, my dear," Susan said, gratefully releasing her hold on the bag. "Ah, here we are," Charles said, stepping through an open set of double doors made of dark wood with polished brass handles. Ginger caught her breath slightly as she followed him in. The room was a large, beautiful library. Books filled shelves that stretched along two walls. The one wall, without shelves, sported a large fireplace containing a flickering blaze even though it was late August. A large painting of a rambling country house backed by a thick woodland hung above the mantel. In the background of the painting, a fox hunt was in full flight, the riders' red coats and the fur of the fox like droplets of blood on the canvas. On either side of the painting, dusty animal heads, ibex, zebra, deer, and even a lion, mounted on boards, stared down at the small group of 10 people in the room. The glass eyes of the heads seemed to hold a gleam of reproach that made Ginger shiver. To shake away the feeling, she turned her attention to the living. 6 other contestants were gathered around the table laid out buffet style, with finger food and glasses of Buck's Fizz or Pimm's. There were 4 women and 2 men, all ranging in ages, ethnicities, and personal styles. As introductions began, they all picked up glasses and piled tiny plates with mini sandwiches, scones, squares of fruit, and little crackers with cheese. "I don't suppose you saw anyone from production on your way in?" asked an impressively muscled Indian man with a Bristol accent who'd introduced himself as Manjeet. "Not a soul," Maggie said, tucking her hands into the back pockets of her black jeans. "Have you seen anyone at all yet?" "No one was here when we arrived. We just followed the equipment to here and found the buffet waiting," said Lily, a bright and perky young woman who looked barely over 18. She had softly slanting hazel eyes and dark red hair impressively styled into 1950s style curls. In fact, her whole look was adorably vintage. Bright red lipstick, a black and white polka dot dress layered under a knitted bolero cardigan, with a felt kitten stitched on either side, and red, thick-framed glasses. There was just a sign saying not to eat or drink anything until everyone was here, added Jack, a tall and skinny Welshman dressed casually in a blue sweater and faded blue jeans. He had his curly blonde hair tied back into a small ponytail. "Perhaps someone will come and brief us now we're all here," suggested Calliope, nervously tugging at some of her hip-length wavy brown hair. The movement caused the collection of wooden, metal, and crystal-studded bangles on her arms to rattle softly, reminding Ginger of a rain stick. Or perhaps this part is where we're all brutally murdered, joked Nadine, sprawled in one of the armchairs by the fire, her boots propped up on the side table. She was a stocky woman with bright pink hair, black lipstick, and a host of facial piercings. Despite her intimidating appearance, Ginger liked her immediately. "You shouldn't joke about such thing," chastised Annabelle, a very pale woman who looked to be in her late 40s, neatly dressed in a blue tweed skirt and jacket, polished patent leather shoes with a low heel, pearl necklace and earrings, and with her blonde hair perfectly coiffed. "It's morbid and uncouth." "I take it the Saw franchise isn't really your thing, huh, Annabelle?" Nadine said with a grin, emptying her glass of Buck's Fizz in a final gulp. Ginger raised an eyebrow in surprise as Annabelle gasped, eyes going wide, her hand flying to her chest. "I didn't mean to offend you," Nadine quickly said, sitting upright, concern on her face. "I'm sorry." But Annabelle didn't respond. Instead, she started to cough uncontrollably. The glass of Pimm's in her hand dropped to the floor, staining the Persian-style rug. Manjeet and Nadine both rushed forward, but neither was quick enough to catch the older woman, as she too fell to the ground. Ginger felt a sick sense of panic deep in her gut as the woman she had only met a few minutes before began to violently convulse on the floor. "What's happening?" Lily said, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in shock. "Help!" Calliope called, rushing to the door. "Anyone on the team, please help. I think she's had an allergic reaction." As foam began to spatter out of Annabelle's mouth and her eyes went glassy, Ginger began to suspect that this was caused by more than an allergy. Moments later, Annabelle fell still, her panicked eyes still open wide. There was no sign of breathing, and Ginger felt the room start to spin around her as she realised that the woman was very much dead. Chapter 6. Nobody moved. There was only the sound of the fire burning in the grate. To Ginger, the crackling of the red-hot logs sounded eerily similar to a low demonic cackle. Everyone looked at each other. No one said anything, but Ginger saw her own fear reflected back in the eyes of her companions. Annabelle remained unmoving on the floor, the froth dripping from the corner of her mouth, now tinged a delicate pink. Susan stooped to respectfully pull the other woman's practical tweed skirt down over her knees, hiding the glimpse of her pale thighs that had been revealed during her ignominious struggle with death. The silence was broken when Lily giggled, the adorable sound an intense contrast to the event that had just taken place. She instantly clapped a hand over her mouth, mortified. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her perfectly applied red lipstick smudged by her palm. "I laugh when I'm nervous, and this all seems so insane and impossible," Nadine suggested, the leather of her well-worn combat boots creaking as she rocked back on her heels, still crouched by Annabelle. "Yes," Lily whispered, tugging at the lace edging on her cat-themed cardigan. "Something like that." Manjeet rose from his place beside the body, on the floor, and crossed to the buffet table, beginning to examine each plate of food and sniff the drinks. "Maybe this sounds kind of out there," Jack said, hands stuffed into his pockets as if he didn't know what to do with them. "But what if this is all part of the mystery part of the show, like Clue or something? What if the producers are going for a super unscripted tone, so they've just thrown us all together and given us a murder to solve for the show?" He put air quotes around murder and then gestured to Annabelle. Perhaps Annabelle was an actor planted by the crew to kick off the plot they have planned. Ginger could tell that Jack was trying to sound calming and confident for Lily's benefit, but he was clearly just as spooked as the rest of them. "If that's the case," Manjeet said from over by the table, "then this production must really be committed to the reality part of the reality show, because that woman is very much dead. Not playing dead. Actually, dead." Ginger felt a sinking sense of dread as she realised that her gut instinct was right, and that this had been too good to be true. But she took a deep breath, feeling a strange blanket of calm beneath her very reasonable panic. Now that she knew the vague suspicions that she'd been harbouring were correct, she could focus on solving the problem. Perhaps her many hours spent absorbed in murder mystery novels would finally come in handy. But first, she needed to know the rules of this game. From the foaming mouth and the speed of the effect, it's obviously some kind of toxin, she said to Nadine as the goth woman finally got to her feet. Probably something from the buffet, Maggie said quietly, looking slightly nauseous. Calliope immediately gave a small whimper, wrapping her sun-browned arms across her belly. Oh God, are we next? We all ate the same thing, after all. Oh God, I should have listened to Esther when she said this whole thing gave off bad energy. What kind of wife am I for not listening to her? If it is the buffet, then this library is very soon going to look like the final scene of Hamlet, Charles muttered, pulling out a large blue handkerchief from his pocket and mopping nervous sweat from his forehead. Not a bad way to go for a man of the stage such as myself. Ginger knew she somehow needed to stop everyone from spiralling into panic. It would only make things worse. Look, she began, stepping forward with her hands raised calmingly. I highly doubt the rest of us are going to die. We all started eating and drinking the same things at the same time, and Annabelle was the only one affected. I don't want to die, Lily whispered. I'm only 20. I've got so much to do. I meant to go to China with my mum this October to see my grandparents. Everyone jumped in surprise as Manjeet flipped the buffet table in one swift motion. Plates and glasses smashed across the floor, the remains of the food and drink scattered everywhere. Calliope and Lily let out short screams of shock. Ginger exchanged a quick look of concern with Maggie as Nadine marched straight up to Manjeet, grabbing him roughly by the shoulder. I get it, she said tightly. You're freaked out. All you're seeing in your head right now are your kids' faces, thinking how you'll do anything to see them again. Well, so are a lot of us. Breaking stuff isn't going to help anyone. That rage, that fear, can be put to better use. As she carefully draped a blanket over Annabelle's still form, Ginger watched the two tougher-looking members of the group connect on some level unknown to her. They recognised a similarity in each other that fast-tracked their trust of one another. Then, Manjeet nodded, his broad, muscled chest swelling like a barrel as he took a deep breath. Thanks, he said gruffly. Nice de-escalation skills you got there. Former police, army? Nadine chuckled briefly. I am a bouncer in Bristol on the weekend, a counsellor at a juvenile detention centre during the week, and I've got a 5-year-old daughter with ADHD. My life is spent de-escalating situations. Is now really the time to list off your CV? Calliope snapped, hunched over in one of the armchairs by the fire, still clutching her stomach. This isn't some seedy nightclub or a bath time meltdown. Someone is trying to kill us. Nadine scowled. Well, I don't see you doing anything particularly helpful, patchouli patch kid, she retorted. Let's try and keep things civil, Ginger said carefully, not wanting to draw the ire of both women her way, but knowing that once fighting started, it would be difficult to stop. Has anyone seen a landline phone in this place? Or have any of you been given your phones back? No landlines in here, Maggie said, examining some cables where they disappeared into the wall. Just did a quick loop of the room and there's nothing like that. And we haven't seen anyone since we arrived, Jack said from the chaise longue where he was comforting Lily. We dropped our phones into the box in that weird glass wall, but no one's given them back. It's only been a little while since we got here, Ginger pointed out, gesturing to herself, Maggie, Charles and Susan. Maybe our phones are still in the box and we can break them out. Manjeet grabbed a large silver candelabra off one of the side tables. I worked in construction for a long time before I opened my gym, he said, heading for the door. I'm sure I can get the phones back. As he stepped out into the hall, however, the group were given another shock. "That would be unwise of you, Mr. Banerjee," said a sourceless male voice. It was a distinguished voice that immediately reminded Ginger of Arthur Amberley, the patriarch of an incredibly rich family well known around Little Chiswick for their financially induced sense of entitlement. The voice dripping like poison from the speakers had the same tone. "I am your gracious host for the weekend," continued the voice in a mockery of welcome. "And all of you in this room have earned your place here through your own misdeeds and arrogance. You have caused harm to others, which shall now be revisited upon you." "What the hell are you talking about, mate?" Manjeet shouted to the empty air, the candelabra still clutched in his hand. "I've never hurt anyone in my life," Lily said, bewildered. "I'm at uni studying to be a primary education teacher. I don't even kill spiders." "I don't think we're dealing with a rational individual here," Ginger said, her palms becoming unexpectedly damp with nervous sweat, as she wondered why the host had chosen her as a candidate. In a bid to avoid eye contact with anyone, for fear of any guilt showing in her face, Ginger instead looked around the room for any sign of a speaker or viewing window where someone could be hiding, but there was nothing. "I would like to welcome you all to my home," their gracious host said. "You are being given the opportunity to prove your worth at your most raw and vulnerable, but keep in mind that any of you in this room could have killed Annabelle." Ginger glanced back at the blanket-covered form on the floor. Had one of the other contestants done this? How? "As you might have guessed, this baking competition is unlike any other," the gracious host informed them. "The challenges you'll face aren't only about cakes and fancy macarons. You also need to find out which of you is the killer. The longer it takes for you to uncover the murderer, the more likely it is that others in the group will meet a similar fate to Annabelle's." "This is insane!" Calliope shrieked, leaping to her feet. "Let us go. I'm begging you. I have a child. I have a wife. You can't do this." Susan, who up until now had said almost nothing, tried approaching the panicking woman, laying a calming hand on her shoulder. Calliope, however, shied away, as if the older lady had come at her with a knife in hand. Ginger couldn't believe that the seeds of distrust planted by their host had taken root so quickly, as she began looking at the group around her with new, more suspicious eyes. "If you succeed in all of the challenges and correctly identify who poisoned Annabelle, then you will be free to go," the host said calmly. "Now, smile for the hidden cameras and proceed to the kitchen to prepare for your first baking challenge. You have 10 minutes. There was a slight click, and the voice said no more. "What do we do?" Jack asked, an audible waver in his voice. Outside the library, one of the filming lights turned on out of nowhere, the blinding spotlight pointing further down the hallway to where Ginger imagined the kitchen was waiting for them. "I would suggest doing as he says is a safe course of action," Charles said, squaring his shoulders and following the light. Manjeet gave a huff of disgust and disappeared in the opposite direction. "The phones are gone," he called back. "I'll try and break through instead." A few moments later, there came the sound of metal striking a solid surface over and over again. The pace became frantic, and Manjeet yelled in frustration. The now bent and battered candelabra came clattering along the hallway, skidding to a stop outside the library doors. Manjeet followed soon after, his dark brown eyes filled with disgust. "Whatever that wall is made of," he said, "it's not glass." Without another word, he stalked toward the kitchen, temporarily defeated. One by one, the others followed, until Ginger was left standing in the library with only Annabelle's body and the phantom eyes of the hidden cameras for company. For just a few seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full depth of her panic, letting it fill her chest until she couldn't breathe and her vision went hazy. Then, she straightened her back and took a deep breath. Chapter 7. The huge kitchen contained 10 island workstations, complete with ovens and hobs. An open ceiling showed off the exposed beams that Ginger, from experience of her own centuries-old cottage, suspected were original to the manor house. As each of the contestants claimed a place, everyone kept flickering nervous, suspicious glances at one another. Ginger avoided eye contact as much as possible, trying to calm her nerves. She'd never considered just how many opportunities for killing someone a kitchen provided. The more she looked around, the more worried she became. If one of the contestants really was intent on performing more murders, then the kitchen had the potential to become a death trap. It was clear that a lot of time, labour and money had gone into creating the setting. Hand-painted tiles from the Victorian era surrounded a storage area that had once been the open fireplace used for all cooking in the manor, but now held spices, herbs and various other seasonings. Everything else in the kitchen was startlingly modern. A range of appliances, some of which Ginger didn't recognise, lined the shelving units on either side of the fireplace. Between the units, there were 2 wooden doors labelled dry goods and 2 metal doors labelled perishable goods. The short wall opposite the door they had entered through was almost entirely taken up with a large mirror. As Ginger tied on her apron, she noted just how unsettling it was to see the whole room reflected to her and her fellow contestants. "Nothing like a giant mirror to encourage us to watch one another," Maggie said from the workstation in front of Ginger. She looked completely different from the bright-eyed young woman from the car. Her gaze was hollow, and her lips were now dry and ragged from her anxiously gnawing on them. Ginger only gave a subtle noise of agreement, her mind whirring as she continued looking around the room. She tried to remember everything she could about the construction of reality television shows. Admittedly, it wasn't very much. Also, since the event had started with a murder, it didn't seem very likely that their gracious host was playing by the rules. Still, if she could spot even a few of the psychological traps, no doubt peppered around the set, then it might give her a scrap of an advantage. Her gaze drifted to the row of tall windows that took up the upper half of the wall opposite the shelving units. Squinting against the setting sun prying through the glass, she tried to make out how heavy-duty the locks seemed to be, figuring that if there was a chance, they could be broken or picked. It wouldn't be difficult to clamber up onto the brushed steel worktops lining the lower portion of the wall and make a break for freedom. "Welcome to your first challenge, my dear contestants." Ginger couldn't help but shudder at the sound of the man's voice. It was strange to be addressed in such a way by someone who sounded like he should be announcing the winner of the church raffle, not laying out the rules in a house of horrors. "I like to call this test mirror image," the gracious host announced. As he said the words, the large mirror that Ginger had previously thought was only screwed into the wall became two-way glass. For just a moment, Ginger got the impression of a silhouetted male figure seated in a wheelchair, the bulky black shape of an oxygen tank by his side. Then, the mirror showed only their own shocked faces. Ginger had to brace herself on the worktop, swallowing back the bile that surged up her throat. The silhouette, whether it was their gracious host or someone else, sharply reminded her of painful things that she would rather forget. "Are you all right, dear?" Susan asked from the workstation to Ginger's right. Ginger managed to nod, pushing the memories away and forcing herself to listen to their host's twisted guidelines. "Your challenge this evening is to perfectly recreate the buffet meal that you shared in the library with your fallen companion," their host continued. Only now, Ginger could swear that she could hear the faint hiss of an oxygen mask. "That's so messed up," Jack muttered, hastily retying his hair into its ponytail. Charles shushed him swiftly. "I'd like to not be next on this madman's list, so kindly let me hear the instructions," he hissed, cupping a hand around his ear and swivelling slightly to find where the voice was strongest. Ginger wondered if he was somewhat hard of hearing, but had been too proud to get hearing aids fitted. Their gracious host continued. "You will not be provided with a recipe. The pantries and fridges contain all the ingredients you will need. The question is whether you can recall the individual flavours from the buffet, like a true professional baker, Or did you just stuff it down your throat as quickly as possible, like the careless posers you truly are? I feel like you're hitting us with some wildly misdirected resentment, Nadine said sardonically. Maybe try therapy instead of doing whatever this is. And I think that you should remove the paring knife you slipped into your waistband and put it back in the knife block, Miss Rush, the voice said coldly. Nadine flushed almost as pink as her hair as everyone gave her incredulous and nervous looks. Ginger suspected, however, that the reaction was caused by rage rather than shame. Was it rage at being denied a weapon she planned to use later on one of them? Or was it something more noble, such as wanting a way to defend herself and others if needed? This is an excellent example of why you should keep a close eye on your fellow contestants, the host said, sounding like a lecturer going on a tangent. Especially since once you have baked your creations, you will each be tasting one another's dishes. Who knows what the killer among you is planning? It would seem unwise to repeat the poisoning trick used on dear departed Annabelle, but maybe they think it would be easier to kill you all in one fell swoop and find a way out on their own. This is all just to try and divide us, Manjeet said loudly, looking around the room. Remember that. But one of us must have killed her, Calliope said, clutching the wooden worktop of her station. We all had the same food and drinks. If it was all poisoned, we'd all be dead. Someone must have slipped something into what Annabelle ate. Bake and talk, their host chided. You have 3 hours. A large digital clock with glowing red numbers appeared across the breadth of the mirror, beginning to count down. For a few seconds no one moved, instead looking slowly from one to the next of their fellow bakers. In the end, Ginger took a breath and stepped out from behind her workstation, heading toward the closest door marked dry goods, which she assumed would be the pantry. You heard the ominous disembodied voice, she said, opening the door. We've got 3 hours. Let's bake. The atmosphere remained tense and mostly quiet for the duration of the 3 hours. Each contestant was soon lost in the process of beating eggs, rubbing butter into flour for short crust pastry, seasoning mincemeat, or rolling out marzipan. However, it was clear that some people were falling for their gracious host's mind games more than others, although those affected were not necessarily the ones that Ginger would have expected. Following the incident with the knife, Nadine seemed to decide to be preemptively suspicious of everyone. Several times she randomly accused others of putting something strange into their mixing bowl. When she did this to Lily, the girl instantly burst into tears and Jack came rushing over, demanding Nadine cut it out and go back to her own workstation. Manjeet, who was the closest, had to step between Jack and Nadine, using his bulk to split them apart. Calliope, despite her previous panic, disappeared into the task, barely looking around her as she efficiently went about recreating their previously deadly dining experience. About an hour into their task, Charles lost his grip on the glass bowl of eggs he was beating for the mini quiches. The sound of the bowl breaking sounded like a bomb going off, echoing off the cavernous ceiling along with Charles' articulate swearing. Maggie shrieked in shock, and Ginger swore as she burned her wrist on a hot tray of mini sausage rolls. Strangely, the accident broke some of the tension, and a few people even began chatting quietly to one another as they continued cooking. Susan remained very quiet, and Ginger couldn't help but worry about how the older woman was coping. She'd already felt weary during the trip, and so much had happened since then. Spending 3 hours on her feet, watched over by an ominous countdown clock, was likely not doing Susan's dodgy hip or her peace of mind any good. If you need any help with anything, Susan, just let me know, Ginger offered her neighbour. You must be exhausted by now. Charles, from his place in front of Susan, scoffed. You're slightly overacting the role of concerned companion, young lady, he said snidely, still bitter about having to restart his quiche filling. Watch out for this whippersnapper adding something special to your Bakewell tarts, Susie. Stop trying to be a gommyclipe, Maggie said, shaking a wooden spoon at the older man. It might have seemed threatening, except the spoon was covered in cheese and chive scone dough, and no one understood what exactly the Filipino Scot was trying to say. She rolled her eyes at their blank stares. "Stop trying to be a stupid snitch," she said. "It's what the man behind the mirror wants." To everyone's surprise, Charles chuckled. "Gommy clipe," he repeated slowly, the words somehow sounding even more alien in his private school accent. "I rather like that, Maggie." "Not the reaction I was going for," Maggie muttered, returning to kneading and rolling her scones. "But, okay." "I would appreciate it, Ginger, if you could get me that large bowl down from the shelf," Susan said with a weak but sweet smile. "I can't reach it on my flat feet and my knees can't manage using the step stool." "Of course," Ginger said, walking over to the shelves with the old woman. As she reached up for the bowl, however, Susan stepped closer and whispered so quietly that even Ginger could barely hear her. "I know the voice of our host. I just can't for the life of me remember where I know him from. He's rich, I know that, and powerful, but I can't recall a name or even a face." Ginger slowly passed the bowl down, her thoughts racing. Knowing the name of their captor wouldn't necessarily help them get out, but it would give them information. And information was power. "The curse of growing old, hey?" Susan said with another wobbling smile, and Ginger suspected she wasn't referring to not being able to reach the bowl. The clock continued the countdown, and tense silence fell once more as everyone hurried to finish off their dishes. Their gracious host hadn't specified what would happen if they didn't finish in time, and no one wanted to find out. "And here I was, thinking I don't work well under pressure," Maggie joked darkly to Ginger as the two of them placed their completed mini buffet at the end of their workstations. "My mother would be impressed." There came a subtle click, followed by the voice of their host. "Excellent work, everyone, even if a few of you made a mistake here or there." Ginger glanced over as Manjeet growled something under his breath, his scarred knuckles turning white as he clenched his fists. "Now, sample each other's food. Taste test the competition, if you will." There came another click, and their host said no more. One by one, they all tried one another's food, but despite how delicious it all was, no one enjoyed it. With every bite, Ginger waited for the burn of poison in her mouth or throat. Fresh, fluffy scones felt like gravel in her mouth. Eating the delicate Battenberg cakes was like swallowing glass. But no one collapsed, and slowly the group began to relax. "I told you it was all just psychological warfare," Jack assured Lily. "There's no poison." Of course, that was the moment that Maggie rushed for the sink before doubling over and beginning to vomit violently. "Oh God," Ginger whispered as Lily and Calliope started screaming. "Not again!" Chapter 8. Rushing to Maggie's side, Ginger held back the younger woman's hair. "Whose food was she eating?" Nadine demanded, glaring at the rest of the group. "Who did this?" Lily raised a shaking hand, bewilderment clear on her sweet face. "She was eating my quiches, but I swear I didn't put anything in them." To everyone's surprise, however, Maggie began to straighten up, no longer retching. "I'm fine," she croaked. "Sorry for panicking, everyone. I tend to throw up when I'm stressed, and I guess it just finally hit me how insane this whole thing is." Ginger heaved a sigh of relief, passing Maggie a sheet of kitchen paper to wipe her mouth with. "So, it wasn't my food?" Lily asked tentatively, wringing her hands. Maggie shook her head, rinsing her mouth out and washing the sink before answering properly. "It wasn't your food, Lily. It wasn't any of the food." "But didn't the voice say the poisoner would use this chance to strike again?" Susan uncertainly asked, wincing as she seated herself on a step stool. Her once carefully set white curls were now flattened by the heat of the kitchen and a long day of action. Ginger could see the older woman was out of energy. "Don't believe everything that mad bastard says," she said to Susan quietly, stooping to crouch in front of her. "This is all about trying to get into our heads, remember? I don't even believe that it was one of us who killed Annabelle." "Agreed," Maggie said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It's a classic divide and conquer tactic." They all tensed as there came the subtle click that was becoming rapidly familiar to them all. "What busy bees you've been," said their gracious host. "Congratulations on all remaining alive and for performing so well in the challenge. Now, I must insist you find your bedrooms and get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow holds many more challenges." Ginger flinched as Manjeet let out an unsettling laugh. "You must be completely insane if you think I'm going to take part in this for another day," he growled, leaping up onto the brushed steel worktop. "A woman is dead, and you're making us perform baking challenges like this is sodding Great British Bake Off." Jack began to nod in agreement. "There are more of us than there are of you," he yelled, shaking his fist at the mirror, although Ginger doubted the figure behind it was still there. "We're not going to do what you say anymore." "We can break our way out of here," Nadine said, digging through a drawer of knives and passing one, a cleaver, handle first, to Manjeet, where he was still standing on the counter. "I would not recommend this as a plan of action," Charles said, nervously looking around the room as if their host would appear at any moment. "There is surely a smarter way to escape this than brute force?" Ginger felt a growing sense of unease. "Maybe." "Let's stop it and think for a second," she suggested, stepping closer to Manjeet so she could keep her voice low, hoping their host wouldn't be able to hear her. "I'm with you that we should try and find a way out of here, but the host told us that this place is rigged with cameras. The glass wall in the lobby is unbreakable. Do you really think he'd do all of that, but not reinforce the windows somehow? He would know that would be our first thought. Plus," Maggie whispered, joining the group that was slowly bunching closer together, "we don't know what other gadgets he's got set up throughout the house, even if he doesn't have the power or bandwidth to run them all at the same time. There's some kind of two-way audio system. He's able to talk to us and can hear us, so he'll know in advance what we're planning." Manjeet sighed, crouching to place a work, roughened hand on Ginger's shoulder. "I know you're trying to help with all this guessing," he said, dark eyes earnest, but filled with a fear Ginger hadn't seen there before. "But I've got kids I want to see again. What kind of dad would I be if I didn't try to fight my way out of here?" Before Ginger could say anything more or make another plea, Manjeet stood, gripped the cleaver tightly, and jammed the blade into the tiny space between the window and the frame in an attempt to break the locking mechanism. Immediately there was a loud crackle and snap of electricity, and Manjeet was launched backwards off the worktop. He gave one strangled cry as he flew through the air like a rag doll before landing on the stone floor with a sickening thud. Nadine swore and ran to him, closely followed by Jack and Ginger. Lily wobbled on her feet for a moment before shakily sitting on the floor as she half fainted. "It would have been in Mr. Banerjee's favour to listen to his fellow contestants," came the smug-sounding voice of the host. "You've spent all day deliberately making us not trust each other, you sadistic prick," Maggie yelled, crouching to check on Lily. Calliope said nothing, shrinking into a huddled ball of misery on the floor. The first thing that Ginger noticed as she approached Manjeet was the acrid smell of burning hair and how his body seemed to be ever so slightly smoking. The second was the rapidly spreading dark stain radiating from his head like a halo onto the polished white stone of the floor. "Retire to your rooms," their host said once again, the voice chilling. "I would prefer not to request this a third time." Ginger and Nadine exchanged a knowing, grieving look as they took in the man's dull, staring eyes. There was no movement of his chest. The pupils were fixed. Manjeet was dead. Chapter 9. Getting a good night's sleep had never been an option, so Ginger wasn't surprised when she spent the next 9 hours tossing and turning beneath the sheets. It wasn't that the bed was uncomfortable. On the contrary, the room was luxurious. Her bag had been waiting outside the door for her the night before, as if this were a fancy hotel. There were sheepskin rugs covering the hardwood floors, a king-size four-poster bed, and stunning views out over the countryside. In any other scenario, Ginger would have delighted in the perfectly firm mattress and goose-down pillows, feeling like she really was at a spa for the weekend, as she'd told her mother. But the accommodation was spoiled somewhat after a day filled with double murder and feeling the eyes of their gracious host on her at every turn. So, Ginger gladly greeted the dawn after a night spent trying to think of a way out, interspersed with uneasy naps. Staring up at the patterned fabric of the canopy, which a leaflet on the dresser smugly conveyed, was a pattern designed by William Morris while he stayed at the nearby Broadway Tower with his pre-Raphaelite brethren, Ginger attempted to arrange her night of thoughts into something resembling a plan of action. Everything was made significantly more difficult by the fact that their gracious host, whoever he was, had the ability to watch and hear their every move. Everything they did, they had to assume he could see. The doors and windows weren't an option, as poor Manjeet had made apparent, limiting their options even further. Ginger fiddled with the pendant around her neck, wondering if anyone would ever see what was being recorded straight onto the memory card slotted into the back. She was just thankful that she hadn't bought the model that uploaded directly to online storage using Wi-Fi. The signal out here was terrible, and it wasn't as if their host had left a little card in each room with the Wi-Fi password. She went rigid beneath the sheets as a realization struck her like a hammer. If the signal was bad for them, then it must be equally poor for their host. That meant either all of his audio and camera equipment was wired into the house, or it operated off Wi-Fi. If it was wired in, then they would be able to find the wires and cut them, taking away his eyes and possibly his voice. If the system was wireless, there was no way he could keep track of all the cameras all the time with a weak Wi-Fi signal. That must be why he was doing everything he could to keep them all in the same room as much as possible. If they spread out across multiple rooms, he wouldn't be able to monitor all the cameras at once. Something shaped a little like hope crept into Ginger's chest, beating on her heart like a war drum, telling her to get up and get moving. If she was going to investigate to prove her theory, then she would need tools. When a soft chime sounded, followed by their gracious host telling them all that breakfast was waiting in the dining room, Ginger was already sitting on the edge of her bed, ready to go. She'd taken the time to expand upon her plan for the day, telling herself that the how, the cameras and microphones, was only half the battle. She also needed to figure out the why. There was more to this whole setup than just random violence. That much was clear. Which meant that everyone in the house was invited for a reason, meaning they all had something in common. If she could uncover what that unifying factor was, then they might be able to use that to identify their host. Stepping out of her room, Ginger met Maggie leaving the room across the hall. "You look as tired as I feel," Ginger said as the two of them started down the stairs to the ground floor. "Did you also spend most of the night obsessively searching your room for cameras and audio devices?" Maggie asked wearily, gazing longingly at the glass wall keeping them from the outside world as they passed the entrance hall. Ginger shook her head. "I wouldn't know what I was looking for. However, I did a lot of thinking along the same lines." In little more than a whisper, she explained her idea about the limitations of wireless devices. As she finished, Ginger saw a glimmer of light in Maggie's eyes. "You just might be onto something here, Ginger," she said softly. "Usually, the advice in murder houses is to never split up since that's a surefire way to get dead, but in this case, it might be our only weapon. If you're right, he won't be able to monitor us all." "We should talk to Nadine about it after breakfast," Ginger said, following the blinding light of a spotlight to a room they hadn't been in yet, the dining room. Most of the other contestants were already stiffly seated around the large mahogany dining table that was laid with a continental breakfast spread. There was bread, cheese, cold meats, hard-boiled eggs, fruits, yogurt and pastries, as well as pitchers of juice. Ginger frowned as she took a seat beside Maggie. Nadine, with her shock of bright pink hair, was notably absent from the table. "Do you suppose our gracious host has staff?" Jack asked the table at large, seemingly in some attempt to lighten the mood. "Or do you think he took a break from planning our deaths to make sure we'd have a lovely breakfast to come down to this morning?" From Ginger's other side, she heard Lily, who was wearing a red dress with a sweetheart neckline with a white knitted bolero decorated with felt Dalmatian puppies, make a small noise of pure misery. There was nothing on her plate, and she was biting at her nails. "It's all pre-packaged garbage," Calliope said bluntly, poking at a rubbery egg. "These were no doubt boiled days ago and stored somewhere. Everything else will have come straight out of boxes and bags." "Some people are perfectly happy with such fare," Charles said, spreading cream cheese on bread and adding slices of hard-boiled egg. "Not everyone has jumped onto the bandwagon, carrying the gluten-free, vegan, flavourless slices of cardboard that you're driving. In my day, people didn't need all the fancy nonsense you're flogging off as health food now." "Oh, shut up, you arrogant old goat," Calliope snapped, flinging down her fork with a clatter. "I don't want to create a line of vegan, gluten-free baked goods as some conspiracy. It's because my kid has celiac disease and a milk allergy. She can't eat anything that her friends do. She's 5. Do you know how isolating that is? It's about inclusion and equality, not the rubbish you think it is." "Has anyone seen Nadine this morning?" Susan asked weakly, clearly trying to turn the topic to something more unifying. "I saw her heading downstairs just ahead of me," Jack said. "But I waited at the top of the stairs for Lily, so I don't know if she came in here." Taking a chance, Ginger slowly stood up, her stomach knotting with nerves. "I think there's something more going on here than just random murder," she said quietly. "There must be a reason we're all here. There must be something that connects us all. If we can figure out what that connection is, I think it could help us work out why we're here." Wiping her damp palms on the skirt of her sundress, Ginger sat back down, watching as everyone looked at everyone else. "Charming little speech," Calliope said snidely, "but I can tell you right now that there's no way that my life overlaps with any of you. This is all just the game of some sick bastard who went looking through Instagram for people dumb enough to take his offer." Ginger felt herself flushing, and she looked down at her lap. Why had she thought she could take on a leadership role here? Her 5 years of performance reviews at her London job had always made it clear she didn't have what it took for such a role. "Are you including yourself in that assessment, Calliope?" Jack asked dryly. "Of course," she responded, tossing her long braid back over her shoulder. "I'm many things, but not a hypocrite. Everyone here was as stupid as everyone else." "You really live your mission for inclusion and equality, huh?" Maggie said, tearing a slice of Gouda into smaller and smaller pieces. "Well, I refuse to be painted with that brush," Charles said brusquely. "I was deliberately misled, just like I was by those emails from that fake Nigerian prince. And I would suggest that maybe Miss Burnet is trying to do something similar by asking us to open up about our personal lives. What if she's the one who poisoned Annabelle?" Jack rubbed at his temples. "None of us poisoned Annabelle," he said slowly, as if talking to a small child. "It's utterly impossible. That was just something the host said to make us turn on each other, which is exactly what's happening." "I think Ginger is onto something," Lily said, speaking up for the first time. She gave Ginger a small smile and a nod as she continued. "We're all smart, capable people who made a mistake," she said. "But we need to find a way to work together, or things are only going to get worse." "I agree," Susan said before compressing her lips and turning to Charles. "These young women are trying to help us, Charles. Perhaps you can be a little bit more grateful that we haven't been made the stragglers of the herd left to fend for ourselves." Ginger fought to hide her smile as the old man took on the expression of a chastised schoolboy, before eventually muttering that he would be glad to help however he could. "Don't you think it's interesting that our host hasn't made any remarks during all this?" Maggie whispered to Ginger. "I can understand him leaving us be when we're squabbling, but we're reaching an agreement and he hasn't said anything to disrupt that." "Maybe this is one room he doesn't have audio in," Ginger said just as quietly. "A dead zone?" As if to prove her point, their host began to speak, but the voice came from out in the corridor rather than the dining room. Ginger and Maggie shared a look, making mental notes that the dining room could be a good place to talk in the future. "Please make your way to the kitchen for your first challenge of the day," the host said, continuing to speak as they all stood and filed out. "Since you all love showing off your pointless skills of decorating sugary creations with even more sugar, you will be creating a theatre set for me." "On a cake?" "Where could Nadine be?" Maggie asked. "This one will be a breeze for her. She told me yesterday that her speciality is cake decorating. She's won local awards for it and everything." Everyone returned to the workstations they had used the day before. As Ginger tied on her apron, her eyes couldn't help but drift to the rusty red stain on the floor over by the windows. Manjeet's body had been moved in the night, but his blood remained, soaked into the Cotswold stone. "Each design should represent a place or a situation that is meaningful to you," their host continued. "Something that you desperately hope to see again at the end of this competition. Who knows, I might even have a surprise for you at the end of the challenge, involving some of your inspirations." The mirror at the front of the room suddenly showed dozens of photos falling like autumn leaves. Most of the people Ginger didn't recognise until she suddenly did. Her stomach lurched. "It's our families," Maggie murmured. "He can't really have them, can he? I think I'm going to be sick again." "Time to decorate," the gracious host said, undoubtedly delighted by the wave of panic he had created. "You have 2 hours. The red clock replaced the photos, and Ginger forced back her tears, prompted by the image of her mother cuddling Nina and Miles that she had taken during Christmas the previous year. "Let's get on with it, I guess," Lily said, a steel in her voice that Ginger hadn't heard previously. She squared her tiny shoulders and marched over to the huge walk-in fridge in search of butter and egg whites. Lily opened the door and screamed. From her workstation, Ginger caught a glimpse of pink hair and dangling feet, telling her all she needed to know. Jack ran over with a knife to cut the rope hanging Nadine from the ceiling of the pantry, but Ginger couldn't bear to follow everyone else over to the scene. She sagged forward over the worktop, the hope she'd found earlier starting to melt away. Ginger looked up at the countdown clock, wanting to smash the glass, even though she suspected it was either electrically rigged like the windows or unbreakable like the door in the entrance hall. Suddenly, a ghostly movement behind the glass caught her eye. Squinting, she saw a pale, scrawny young man standing on the other side of the mirror. Her gut said he was in perhaps his early 20s at the most. This couldn't be their host, could it? The voice over the speakers sounded much older and worn by life or even illness. And what about the figure in the wheelchair the night before? The young man's gaze was fixed unerringly on the group by the pantry. As she watched, his head twitched sharply to the side, and he bared his teeth in an unexpected, wild grin. All at once, Ginger found herself staring only at her own confused expression as the mirror returned to normal. Who was he? Chapter 10. Ginger bolted out of the kitchen, hoping she might catch a glimpse of the young man in one of the corridors. But there was nothing. Not a single creaking floorboard in the distance. No glimpse of a figure hurrying around a corner. Nothing. "Ginger?" She turned at Maggie's call, seeing the whole group had followed her out of the kitchen. Jack was holding a sobbing Lily, his own cheeks wet with tears. Susan was crying quietly beside a stone-faced, shaking Calliope. Ginger started to explain, but then she stopped, remembering that in the corridor they would be overheard. Leading the way to the dining room, she ushered everyone inside and then shut the door. "I saw someone," Ginger finally blurted, A guy behind the mirror. He was watching you all cut Nadine down. I don't think he realised I could see him." "The guy in the wheelchair?" Maggie asked, frowning. Her face was streaked with tears, but she wiped them away to focus on the puzzle at hand. "Did you see his face?" "Different guy," Ginger shook her head. "He was younger, probably early 20s, and he wasn't in a wheelchair." "That makes sense," Lily said, hiccuping on another sob. "One old guy in a wheelchair wouldn't be able to do all of this, would he? He must have someone helping him." "The old guy is the voice, and the young guy is the one setting everything up? Getting rid of bodies? That kind of thing," Jack suggested. "We should go and look for him," Lily said, extricating herself from Jack's arms, much to his visible disappointment. Even in a place this size, there can't be that many ways to move bodies from one place to another. "Old houses of the gentry like this one will likely be riddled with servants' passages," Susan said, dabbing her tears with a pink handkerchief. "I was in service very briefly as a young woman in a house somewhat like this one, and we could reach almost every room in the house without ever setting foot in the main house." "Let's start tapping on some walls then," Maggie said. "If Ginger just saw this guy, then we don't have long before he could be anywhere in the building. We need to corner him." Charles cleared his throat, clearly shaken by Nadine's murder, but the expression on his face was mainly one of suspicion. "I would like to point out that Miss Burnet is the only one to have seen this mysterious figure," he said. "Have any of you considered that maybe she's lying, trying to split us up and send us on a wild goose chase? It would be much easier to pick us off one by one that way." "You really are determined to point your suspicions in all the wrong directions," Maggie said incredulously. "I don't know exactly when Ginger would have had time to kill Nadine this morning, since I walked down to breakfast with her. Jack saw Nadine head down first, and she was still warm when we found her, even though she was in the fridge. She died while we were eating, where all of us could see Ginger." Ginger felt a warm sense of gratitude in her chest for the short, plump Filipino Scot beside her. "Thank you," Ginger said, putting a hand briefly on Maggie's shoulder. "It feels good to have someone in my corner over and over again when accusations are being tossed around like confetti." Maggie flushed and gave a curt nod. "Just don't actually be a killer or anything," she muttered. "That would make me look like a right dumbass." "It makes no logical sense that Ginger has killed anyone," Calliope said from the table. "Find a different target for your illogical stabs in the dark, Charles." She had been the only one to sit down, keeping herself apart from the group, her arms folded tight across her belly in a move that Ginger was beginning to recognise as her panic response. "None of us are doing the killing here," Lily said, her voice still shaky but her eyes fierce. "So how are we going to find the one who is?" "Agreed," Jack said, folding his skinny arms across his narrow chest in an attempt to look imposing. "We need to find these servants' passages." Ginger suggested this morning that since the signal out here is so bad, most of his gear is going to have to be wired in, leaving only a few things to operate wirelessly, Maggie pointed out. "If we can find the speakers our host is using to communicate with us, then we might be able to follow the wiring back to some kind of control room." Charles reluctantly fished into his pocket, pulling out a small, perfectly maintained Swiss Army knife. "If we find any cameras or speakers, we might be able to render them useless with this," he said, passing the tool to Maggie. "You seem to know what you're doing with that kind of thing, so I entrust it to you." Maggie took it graciously, fiddling around until she found the screwdriver. "Time for some sabotage," she said with a grin. Stoked into action by their plan, the group exited the dining room and immediately split up, going to search different rooms. Ginger stayed with Susan, concerned about the older woman being left alone. Maggie paired up with a grumbling but visibly nervous Charles. Calliope had silently gone off on her own, wielding a large knife, her expression one of such grim determination that Ginger, momentarily, feared that one of the group would soon be found, stabbed to death and wrapped in a curtain in the drawing room. In a move that surprised no one, Jack and Lily made up a third pair. "Don't you think it's rather sweet That those two have found some kind of romance in the middle of all this awfulness? Susan asked, shadowing Ginger as they closely investigated the library. Annabelle's body had disappeared in a similar manner to Manjeet's, a slight stain on the rug where she had died, the only sign she had ever been there. Ginger went up onto tiptoe, trying to track a set of cables running up above one of the bookshelves. "At the risk of sounding like Charles," she said, "I think we have slightly more pressing issues here than to waste time making doe eyes at each other." Susan, who was pressing her ear to the wall as she tapped at the panelling, chuckled at that, but her amusement was cut short by the voice of their host. "You will return to the kitchen immediately," he said, sounding surprisingly calm, considering they were deviating from his plan. "The challenge is still in progress. Return to the kitchen." "You expect us to keep decorating cakes while Nadine is there on the floor?" said Lily from somewhere nearby, her voice muffled by walls and distance. "We're not going to let you terrorize us anymore." "You will return to the kitchen," said their host. "If you do not do as instructed, there will be dire consequences." Despite the threat, Ginger couldn't help but notice that the tone remained exactly the same. Surely he should be apoplectic with rage over their refusal to comply. "I still can't shake the feeling that I know his voice," Susan said insistently, pressing a shaking hand to her face, closing her eyes in concentration. "Such a long time ago." "Do not test my patience," their host warned, voice flat and cold. "You have seen only a fraction of the damage I am capable of inflicting. Each of you will suffer for your disobedience unless you return to the kitchen immediately." "Ginger!" Maggie came skidding into the doorway of the library. "I found something, but I need another set of hands to help me out." Hurrying toward the door, Ginger beckoned to Susan. "Come with me," she said. "I don't want to leave you alone here." Susan blinked several times, looking slightly confused, and Ginger was suddenly struck by just how old she looked. The past day had taken a rapid toll on her. Making sure Susan was following behind her, Ginger and Maggie hurried into a room none of them had ventured into before. It looked as if it had once been a study, or perhaps a private parlour. The walls were lined with glass cases holding bones and butterflies and strange dried plants. Unlike in the other rooms they'd seen, the furniture was all covered in heavy dust sheets, making it feel as if the space was filled with ghosts. "He's been talking so much that I was able to pin down where one of the speakers was. I put it out of commission with a knife, by the way. It was out in the hall," Maggie said, out of breath from excitement. "Charles followed the wires in one direction, and I traced them into here. There aren't any speakers as far as I can tell, but there are these." She pointed to a thicker collection of wires hung in little plastic cradles along the wall and disappearing into an apparently random spot in the plaster. "They look important," Ginger mused, wondering how they could cut the wires without electrocuting themselves. "But why hasn't he tried to hide them at all?" "I don't think this room is even meant to be open," Maggie said, eyes gleaming. "He must have forgotten to lock the door when he came back in here after leaving the kitchen. Because I think this is one of the ways he gets into the servants' passages." Rushing forward, she traced the outline of a door barely visible in the wall. "Well, damn," Ginger breathed. "Let's see if we can get this thing open." So before they could begin to figure out how to open the door, however, they heard Charles give a terrified yell, followed by a sickening thud. "That can't be good," Susan said. "I would guess these are the consequences our host warned us about." Following the sound only slightly further down the hall, Ginger's heart sank as she saw the gaping darkness of a trapdoor in the floor. It seemed Susan was right. Jack and Lily, both flushed and wide-eyed, dashed down the stairs. Calliope, who had gone off on her own, came dashing back from the direction of the entrance hall, a chipped knife in her hand. "I was trying to take the hinges apart," she said almost defensively when she saw Ginger looking at the knife. "Fat lot of good it did, though." "What happened?" Lily asked, and Ginger noticed for the first time that the girl was gripping a little paring knife in one hand. "I think Charles fell," Maggie said. Ginger carefully stepped around the hole, her heart thundering as she waited for another of the tiles to fall away beneath her feet. "Go on your belly," Jack suggested, remaining out of harm's way on the stairs. "Increase your surface area so if another trapdoor opens, only half of you will fall in and will be able to pull you out." Ginger did as he suggested, feeling equal parts ridiculous and terrified as she slithered closer to the hole. "Charles?" she called down into the darkness. "Are you down there?" She couldn't see anything in the Stygian gloom, but they all heard a faint groan. "We're going to find a way to get you out," Jack called, but before he finished speaking, the trapdoor closed, leaving Charles down below. Ginger rested her forehead on the cold floor for a moment, all at once achingly overwhelmed by the situation she was in. She hadn't asked for any of this. All she had wanted was to bake cakes and take part in a silly reality show. "You were warned." The voice of their gracious host was fainter than before, probably because Maggie had removed one of the speakers. "If you continue to rebel, things will only get worse for you all. Now, return to the kitchen and finish your task." Ginger got to her feet, seeing that the group around her had all visibly deflated as their brief hope was dashed. "Nothing gets me more in the mood for fighting with royal icing than threats," Maggie said softly, staring at the Swiss Army knife for a moment before tucking it into her pocket and walking toward the kitchen. As Ginger began to follow, Susan suddenly paled, pressing a hand to her mouth and stumbling against the wall for support. "Are you all right?" Ginger asked, hurrying to her side, worried that the stress of the situation had taken a deadly toll on the woman. Getting a surprisingly firm grip on the front of Ginger's sundress, Susan pulled her close. "I finally recalled how I know the voice," she whispered. "And if even half of the tales about him are true, we should be even more frightened than we already are." Chapter 11. "You know who he is?" Ginger asked in a tense whisper, hooking her arm through Susan's and leading them back toward the kitchen. "What do you know about him?" But Susan pressed a warning finger to her lips, then pointed to her ear, reminding Ginger they were likely being listened to at that moment. In the kitchen, they returned to their workstations, but as she and Susan passed one another in the process of gathering ingredients for fondant icing, royal icing, and buttercream to cover the 3-tier plain sponge cake that they were supposed to decorate, they continued their whispered conversation. "His name is Sir Maxwell Hatherton," Susan said in a low voice as she and Ginger searched through the cake decorations for modelling chocolate and food colouring. "It's been such a long time that I struggled to recognise the voice, but Hatherton had an estate near the village where I grew up." "He's got a knighthood, and he's running a murder house?" Ginger asked, incredulous, but then shrugged. "Actually, it kind of makes sense. This whole setup has the hallmarks of someone rich and entitled. In my experience, those two things often don't create very empathetic people." "Hatherton would certainly never be called empathetic," Susan said, using the cover of Jack's electric mixer to speak normally. "I remember how rudely he treated people around the town. Not even his own family was safe from his cruelty. Whenever I saw them all out together, I was always struck by how pale and miserable the children looked." "Hatherton sounds like a positively charming individual," Ginger said sardonically, returning to her workstation to finish coating her cake in thinly rolled fondant. Lily, who for this challenge was at the workstation in front of Ginger, turned around with a frown on her sweet face. "Did you say Hatherton?" Susan shook a little more icing sugar into her chocolate buttercream and continued mixing. "I did." Ginger could tell that the remains of the group were slowly tuning into the conversation, as Jack and Maggie slowed their assagee attempts at decorating. To Ginger's genuine surprise, Lily unbuttoned her cardigan and reached inside her dress into her bra. Jack blushed to the roots of his blonde hair, an adorably normal reaction that Ginger appreciated even though it felt out of place here. Calliope, who up until now had kept very much to herself, gave Ginger a questioning look to which she could only shrug in reply. Lily began pulling something out of her clothes, but a flash of sunlight glancing off the mirror at the front of the room reminded Ginger that Hatherton, and whoever the younger man was, could be watching them from behind the mirror at that very moment. "Not here," she said quietly, gesturing to the pantry, "somewhere less exposed." "Did any of you see green food colouring in the pantry when you were in there?" Maggie asked loudly. "I think Jack took the last of it and I need a bottle of my own." Jack frowned, clearly confused as he looked at the bottle of blue and red food colouring in front of him. But then realisation dawned on his face. "Maybe you should have been quicker getting it then," he said in a stilted attempt at acting, even adding in a sassy finger snap. It was immediately apparent to Ginger that acting was not one of Jack's skills, but soon he, Maggie and Calliope were engaged in a suitably loud and distracting argument. "Just like actual reality TV," Lily muttered, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to join the scene. "Jack, stop being such a tosser and give Maggie some of the green." In just a few moments, Ginger and Lily were dragging a fake, outraged Maggie away from an overdramatically posturing Jack, who was still fighting with Calliope. "You'd better have sorted your attitude by the time we come out," Lily said by way of a final threat, shaking her finger at Jack. However, Ginger didn't miss the quick wink the pair shared before Lily slipped past her into the pantry and Maggie pulled the door closed. "Show us the treasure from the boob pocket," Maggie immediately whispered. For the first time in a while, Ginger found herself letting out a genuine chuckle. Blushing slightly, but also grinning, Lily pulled out a driver's license. "It's Annabelle's," she admitted quietly, popping open the cover to reveal a driver's license. "I took it from a handbag when Manjeet said she was dead. I did the same thing with Manjeet and Nadine." Reaching into the other side of her bra, she brought out 2 more IDs. Ginger took them both, rage and grief clawing at her ribs as she looked them over. Manjeet's was a pass to his gym, the card proudly bearing the title owner beneath his grinning picture. Nadine's was her ID card for the juvenile detention centre where she had mentioned she worked. Her smile was thin, as if she didn't like being in front of the camera, but her eyes were warm. "I wanted to make sure that if I somehow got out of here, there'd at least be some evidence that they were here," Lily said quietly. So, their families would be left with one less question. The door to the pantry suddenly flew open, scaring all 4 of the women inside, who each let out screams. But instead of a madman with an axe, as Ginger had instinctively expected, it was only Calliope. "Are you going to be much longer in here?" she asked with a shadow of a smile on her anxious face. "I'm really letting off some steam out here, but I'm worried Jack is about to cry." "Just a minute more," Maggie promised. "Maybe encourage him to cry. Let him work through some toxic masculinity. Can't scar him any more than this place already has." Calliope shrugged and shut the door. "Let's cut to the chase," Ginger said. "What did you have to show us, Lily?" The girl pointed to the tiny writing on Annabelle's driver's license. "Don't you think it's a bit too much of a coincidence that Annabelle, with her fancy tweed suits and posh accent and pearls, shares half a surname with the rich arse who's trying to kill us?" Frowning, Ginger squinted at the writing. "Annabelle Hatherton Smythe," she said aloud, lingering over the words. "Why do I feel like I know that name? Susan, do you remember if Hatherton had a relative named Annabelle?" The older woman thought for a moment, mouthing the name over and over. "Bella," she said eventually. "He had a niece he referred to as Bella, but I heard him call her Annabelle when he gave her a dressing down once at the village fete." "Yikes," Maggie muttered. "He sounds like the real nurturing type." Susan shook her head, clearly not picking up on the implied sarcasm. "I spoke with her a few times when I worked in the local corner shop during my 20s. She was a quiet, miserable little thing, frail as a bird. I don't know how old she was then, but I remember seeing her around the village when she was an adult, usually in a car with her uncle." Ginger saw a haunted look cross over Susan's face, as she retreated back into the memories of the past. There was always this trapped, desperate look in her eyes that cut right to my core, Susan said softly. When she was a child, it was painful. But once she'd grown and her sister, I think it was a younger sister, but I don't recall her name, had fled, she would just look continually hopeless. Such empty, hopeless eyes. She took a sharp breath as she returned to the present. But then I moved away for a year or two, and by the time I came back, she'd somehow got away from Hatherton. I never saw her again. Until the other day in the library, Ginger said, squeezing the older woman's shoulder. Although you didn't know it was her. Yes, Susan said with a sad smile. It's a shame, really. I would have liked to say sorry for not doing more to help her back then. The decorating challenge dragged on into the middle of the afternoon. By the time the cakes were completed, everyone was exhausted and emotionally strung out. Given the opportunity to rest for the remainder of the day, the remaining 6 prepared stacked plates of Welsh rarebit and several pots of scalding hot tea. They then spent several hours together in the dining room, quietly discussing how they could band together to find a way out of the house. After the tragic losses of Nadine and Charles, it was obvious to all that no one in the group was responsible for any of the deaths. However, Ginger noted that she wasn't the only one reluctant to return to the hidden door in the strange room. Now, everyone was aware of the random trapdoors. Running around the house had suddenly become even more terrifying. Eventually, they were commanded by Hatherton, their gracious host, to return to their rooms. Everyone was too exhausted to ignore the summons, and so Ginger was soon staring up at the canopy of her bed, hopelessly trying to sleep. Like a discordant, rusting carousel, her thoughts circled around and around. Any other Saturday night, she would be curled up in the sitting room with Nina and Miles, treating herself to a Chinese takeaway while she watched cheesy horror movies. She'd inevitably have to pause the movie partway through to take her mother's usual phone call about whether Ginger would be coming by for Sunday dinner the next afternoon, even though Ginger always visited for this particular meal on a bi-weekly schedule. Right now, however, Ginger wished for nothing more than the soft warmth of her cats in her lap as she patiently explained to her mother for the 1000th time how bi-weekly schedules worked. Soon, the pillowcase was damp with her tears. Still sniffling, Ginger curled herself into a ball, finally slipping into some form of fatigued slumber. It might only have been seconds after her eyes closed, or it could have been hours, that Ginger was ripped from sleep by the lights flickering on and off rapidly several times. The flickering was accompanied by a hair-raising scream from one of the other rooms. The adrenaline sent Ginger leaping to her feet and rushing out into the hall, with her heart trying to rip out of her chest. There, she found Maggie, Calliope and Susan already pale with terror. A few steps away, kneeling on the woven runner laid over the centre boards of the hall, Lily was screaming over and over again. Her silky robin's egg blue pyjamas were stained with blood, along with her face and hands. "Lily?" Ginger asked carefully, walking a little closer and kneeling by the shaking girl. "Lily, what happened?" "Jack's dead," she sobbed. "He's dead. We were together. But there were blades hidden above the bed canopy. They all came down at once, sticking him to the bed. If I hadn't been getting water from the bathroom, I'd have..." Ginger wrapped the girl in a hug as she descended into unintelligible sobs. She looked back at the others, seeing Calliope and Susan crying. Meeting Maggie's eyes, Ginger could see tears there, but also an expression that mirrored what she was feeling. No one else was dying there. They had to get out of there tomorrow. Chapter 12. "And then there were 5, Maggie said quietly. Ginger, on watch with the Scot, only nodded, not stopping her continual stroking of Lily's hair. It was the only thing that had finally helped the devastated girl to sleep, and Ginger wanted her to get as much rest as possible. Once they realised what exactly had happened with Jack, the women all agreed that they would spend the rest of the night together in one room. Hatherton made no comment over the speakers as Ginger and Maggie carried blankets, duvets, and pillows from the other bedrooms into Susan's room to make one giant sleeping nest for them all. "We should probably bring our luggage in as well," Maggie said, panting from the effort of dragging several duvets. "We don't want to get locked away from our clothes and stuff." "I'll go and get Lily's bag," Calliope offered, surprising everyone. "Are you sure?" Ginger hesitantly asked, glancing toward the closed door to the ensuite where Lily had been showering for the past half an hour. "I can always loan her some of my things, so no one has to go into the room where the room where it happened." However, Calliope gave a strange, sad smile. She'll be washing her hair for the 3rd or 4th time by now, but she'll still swear she can feel his blood on her scalp. It will feel like it's soaked into her skin and she'll never get it out. I can assure you that she'll want her own clothes right now. "You sound as if you know what she's been through," Susan said gently, laying another duvet on top of 3 others to thicken the padding for their rest. "I had a car accident about 10 years ago," Calliope said simply. "My girlfriend was driving. She didn't make it." "I'm sorry," Ginger said weakly, wanting to fill the silence even though she knew the words were little more than meaningless. It didn't matter though, as Calliope had already left the room. But her revelation stuck with Ginger like a prickly burr hidden somewhere inside her clothing. As the 5 of them bunched together on the duvet nest, Ginger looked at each of these total strangers that she had been surviving with for the past 2 days. Calliope's admission had sharply reminded her that none of them knew anything about one another, aside from the fact that they all enjoyed baking. As they all huddled closer, whispering plans for their escape, Ginger couldn't shake the thought. Maybe this was the wrong time to hunt down the reason why Hatherton had chosen each of them. But she couldn't help but wonder. Surely there was a reason for all this horror. If not, then what was it all for? Now on watch with Maggie, looking around at Susan and Calliope and Lily asleep around her, the question returned, more insistent than ever. "The one thing I can't figure out is how any of us, apart from Susan, are connected to Hatherton," Ginger whispered to Maggie. "He said on the first night that we'd all earned our places here through our misdeeds and arrogance." She placed heavy sarcasm on misdeeds and arrogance. "But as far as we know, none of us have ever even heard of Hatherton." "The selection could just be random, you know," Maggie said quietly, picking at her fingernails. "We were all just in the wrong place at the wrong time and caught this monster's eye." A creak came from the hallway and Ginger tensed. They had jammed a chair under the door handle, but it wouldn't keep someone out for long if they were intent on entering. But no other sound occurred, so Ginger and Maggie slowly relaxed. "Haven't you also been wondering who the other guy is?" Ginger asked. "Hatherton must be the one in the wheelchair, but who's the younger one running around doing all the dirty work? Hatherton certainly isn't going to be whisking corpses out of rooms while our backs are turned." Maggie frowned. Some of her anxiety lessened as she was distracted by answering the question. "From what all the true crime podcasts I listen to say, either the second guy is a relative, so they have this bond of family trust and history, or he's a random stranger. Hatherton somehow drew into this plan and who is now under his thrall." It felt as if a light had just turned on in Ginger's head. "What if this whole thing is about family?" she said in an urgent whisper. "What if this is really about Hatherton and his niece, Annabelle, and the rest of us are just collateral damage?" Maggie said slowly. 10 little soldiers, but only one of them was the real target. We 9 were just cannon fodder, a smokescreen." "It would explain the pretense with the media company," Ginger muttered. "Hatherton doesn't have his name on any of this. Damn, I wish I had my phone right now. We could see if there was a record of a public falling out between Hatherton and his family that might have led to this." "You know, I thought someone was trying to frame me," Maggie said, so quietly and quickly that it took Ginger a moment to process the words. A lot of it was just stress-induced paranoia, which I struggle with most of the time anyway, but I sort of had a bit of a nervous breakdown a few years ago. Some people got hurt. No, I hurt some people. She sighed, deflating as she released her breath. I didn't mean to, and certainly didn't want to, but, Ginger prompted, squeezing the other woman's arm in a show of support. Whatever you're about to say, Maggie, I won't judge. Lots of us have done things we're not proud of. A flash of memory assaulted her senses, but Ginger pushed it away. She refused to let the door holding her own demons at bay open up tonight. I'd just finished my theatre technology degree, Maggie said. I was already strung out and exhausted from that because you have no idea how intense and competitive places like that are. After working myself to the bone, I managed to get an internship with a really prestigious theatre company. The workdays were long and they barely paid me anything. So I worked at a takeaway on the nights I wasn't interning. She gave a strange, tense chuckle. Did you know sleep deprivation makes you hallucinate? So does hunger. And I'm guessing you weren't sleeping or eating much, Ginger guessed. That sucks, Maggie. I'm so sorry. No wonder you cracked under all that pressure. Yeah, Maggie grimaced. It was messy. There was a fight with a customer one night and I don't really remember much about it. My boss told me later that I ended up breaking a window with a chair and the guy accidentally put his hand into the deep fat fryer when he came at me. Sounds like my old neighbourhood in London on a Friday night, Ginger joked, glad when some of the tension in Maggie's face relaxed. You're nothing like Hatherton and his crony, Ginger added after a few moments of more comfortable silence. I think that you think you are, but you're not, and you don't deserve this. None of us do. Maggie nodded, looking away as she tried to get her emotions under control. Do you think the plan will work? She eventually asked, clearly wanting to move on to other topics. Ginger shrugged, looking at the three sleeping women. I think we've got a good chance, because the alternative is to stay here. When there's only one option, it's amazing what you're capable of. Plus, she said in a more light-hearted tone, I once made a model of the Eiffel Tower that was edible from top to bottom. Does Hatherton really think he's got more creativity and determination than someone capable of that? Chapter 13. Today is your opportunity to dazzle and surprise me. Ginger exchanged a subtle smirk with Maggie. Little did Hatherton know that surprising him was exactly what they were going to do, but perhaps not in the manner he was expecting. From my research via the various insipid baking shows that populate television at this current point in time, no competition is complete without a showstopper round, he continued, his tone remaining the same as always, even as his words became increasingly derisive. Ginger kept the mirror in her peripheral vision, hoping for another glimpse of Hatherton's assistant. If we know the young man, who's the real physical threat, is watching from behind the mirror, then we know Maggie and I will have a head start to get to the hidden door that we found, Ginger had said in low tones to the group when they'd gathered that morning for a sparse meal of toast and tea. Now, looking around the room at Maggie, Susan, Calliope and Lily, she saw the same exhaustion and determination on their faces that she felt bubbling under her skin like molten sugar. Your goal today is to bake your way to freedom, Hatherton droned on, his choice of words catching Ginger's attention properly for the first time. That's right, ladies. The individual who creates the most inventive, impressive, and imaginative showstopper will be allowed to walk out of the front door with all their belongings, free to go wherever they wish. For a moment, panic flooded Ginger's chest as she saw Lily and Calliope perk up and listen when Hatherton offered freedom to the winner. Of course, she understood why they might consider the offer. She'd be lying if a part of her didn't want to latch onto his flimsy offer of survival. But it wasn't real. She was certain of that. There was no chance in heaven or hell that Hatherton was going to let one of them walk away from this place, revealing his crimes to the police, just because they baked a really good cake. Looking back around the room, trying to communicate with her eyes that they needed to stay strong and stick with the plan, Ginger's worries melted like butter when Calliope mouthed something at her that was less than complimentary about Hatherton's heritage. Lily, who had also seen it, gave her a tiny smile. "You had better impress me," Hatherton said, his usual demanding tone making the arrogant demand even more aggravating. "Now, begin." Ginger rolled her eyes, immediately putting their plan into motion. Maggie flicked the double bird at the mirror, then headed for the fridge. Soon, all 5 of them were going through the motions of baking. To any experienced baker, it was clear none of them were making things that were actually edible. Susan was heating a pan full of oil that she loudly claimed was for her famous rhubarb and custard donut tower, but her mixing bowl held a Victoria sponge cake batter. Every single one of the ovens was turned up to maximum heat. Ginger kept an eye on her watch as she whipped up a basic, tasteless batter that vaguely resembled something you'd use for a cake. Soon enough, it was the moment of truth. With a subtle nod to the other women, Ginger put her sloppily filled tray of batter into the oven. The heat was so intense, she had to take a step back when she opened the door. "It won't be long now," she whispered to Maggie, who was at the workstation in front of her. "Make sure you've got everything you think we'll need to get the door open, and the wires ruined, and get ready to run." "Way ahead of you," Maggie murmured, leaving her workstation and heading for the fridge. "Tell Susan to turn up the heat on her oil pan and take a step back. This is going to be dangerous as hell." Ginger strolled over to where Susan was nervously watching her now smoking hot pan of oil. "Maggie is going to get things moving," she said softly, leaning in closer to the older woman. "Get anything you want from your workstation, because you won't be able to go near it soon. Then, get into the pantry." Susan nodded, a sparkle of excitement in her eyes, along with the expected fear. "Be careful," she said, patting Ginger's cheek gently. "I want to be able to put on a spread with you at the county fair someday." Tears welled unexpectedly in Ginger's eyes. "Is that before or after you've kicked my ass in the pie-making competition?" She laughed, wiping at her eyes. Before Susan could reply, Maggie stepped out of the fridge, one hand in a loose fist at her side. "Time to move," Ginger said, ushering the older woman away. When Ginger was back at her own workstation, she met Maggie's eyes and nodded slightly. As the Scot passed Susan's workstation, she threw the ice cube she'd hidden in her palm into the heavily smoking pan of oil. Immediately, there was a sound like a pile of firecrackers going off, and thick black smoke burst from the pan. "Now!" Ginger yelled, flinging open the door of her oven, allowing the smoke from the thoroughly burnt cake inside to rush out into the room. Calliope, Lily and Maggie did the same. Soon the room was filled with clouds of roiling smoke. The perfect cover. "What's going on here?" Hatherton said through the speakers. "What have you done?" But Maggie and Ginger were already running as fast as they could toward the room with the hidden door, the smoke seeping out of the kitchen after them. Chapter 14. It didn't take Ginger and Maggie long to find the strange room. However, unlike the day before, the door was locked. "We don't have time for this," Maggie hissed, looking back over her shoulder. "How are we going to get in?" Hatherton was alternating between cold commands for the contestants to return to their bedrooms and bouts of eerie silence. Somewhere, a smoke alarm started squawking. "Just give me a second," Ginger said as her own panic began to rise. "Let me think." She crouched in front of the door and peered at the lock. It looked like it was also original to the house. After a moment, she reached into her pocket. "This shouldn't be a problem," she said, taking out sculpting tools and starting to poke around to pick the lock. "I've locked myself out of my cottage so many times that my brother, Valerian, taught me how to pick the lock on my back door." There was a squeak, then a click. Ginger grinned triumphantly. She pressed down on the handle and the door swung open. They rushed inside. The furniture was ghostly, and still in the dusty room. "Find the door," Ginger said. "I'll start ripping out these wires. Let's see if it takes away some of his eyes." Maggie dashed to the corner, skimming her fingers over the wall in search of the telltale door frame. Ginger leapt onto a velvet loveseat, releasing a cloud of dust. With the bundled cables now within reach, she began to pull with all her strength. The studs pinning the cables to the wall came free with a series of metallic pops. Ginger nearly fell backwards, but clung to the wires and swung to the floor like they were a vine. "I found the door," Maggie said, Charles' Swiss Army knife in hand. "All I need to do is find a way to open it." With a growl of effort, Ginger gripped the bundle and leaned back. Her full body weight brought the cables snapping out of the wall. There was the shriek of feedback, and out in the hall, Hatherton's voice was cut short. Maggie, who was poking around with the knife blade, made a small squeak of delight. There was a click, and a portion of the wall swung open. "Hell yeah, baby!" Maggie pocketed the knife. "Open sesame." The two of them crept down the narrow, dim passage that lay beyond the door. Ginger swallowed heavily, her stomach heaving with anxiety. They had no idea what was waiting down there. What if they met Hatherton or his partner? "Looks like Susan was right about the servants' passages," Maggie said quietly, pointing down to one of the several smaller paths which branched off the one they were on. "There are others besides this one." Ginger held up a hand, pointing to her ear to tell Maggie to listen. Just a little further down the passage, there was the unmistakable mechanical sound of a computer fan. Taking up the Swiss Army knife with its tiny blade, Maggie gripped it with both hands, fear on her face. They advanced slowly, the yawning maw of a doorway taking shape in the dark. Hands shaking, Ginger tentatively pushed the door halfway open, part of her expecting to see the shape of Hatherton in his wheelchair, oxygen mask hissing. But the room beyond was empty, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of 3 computer screens. Corkboards, weighed down by manic notes and maps and photos, covered the walls. Ginger desperately wanted to look at it all. Hatherton's reasons for all of this could be hidden among the chaos, but they didn't have time. One item, a floor plan of the house, caught her particular attention. Hatherton, or his accomplice, had made a variety of small, distinct marks at different places in the rooms and hallways. It didn't take Ginger long to understand what she was looking at as she recalled the events of the weekend. "Traps," she murmured to herself, heart hammering. "He's marked where all the traps are." Tearing the corners free of the push pins, Ginger folded up the map and tucked it into her bra. She had a feeling they would need a guide to get out of here alive. "Ginger?" Maggie whispered, waving her mobile triumphantly. "I found our phones." After a few moments, however, she swore quietly. "No signal," she said, holding it up in vain. "Even if he has a private network that he's been trying to run his tech on, these old stone walls will wreak havoc on the signal." Grabbing the mobiles from the box balanced precariously on the edge of the dented, generic office desk, Ginger stuffed them into the front pocket of her apron. Pangs of grief hit her as she wondered which phone had belonged to each of the murdered contestants. "Look," Maggie pointed at the monitors. "There are barely any cameras. He was bluffing about being able to watch us all the time." Ginger leaned closer. There were only 4 cameras in total. The library, covering the entrance hall, the corridor where all the bedrooms were, and the smoke-filled kitchen. "I want to have a poke around while we're here," Maggie said, fingers flying over the keyboard as she explored the files and programs. "Let's see if I can turn off the audio input and output." Panic nestled under Ginger's skin, burning like salt in an open wound. "Maggie," she hissed, "we should go. We've got the phones. Come on." But Maggie stayed on task. "If they can't see us or hear us, then it'll make moving around the house a hell of a lot easier," she said. "Why don't you use that other laptop to see if you can message anyone in your family to call the police? And maybe look up some info on Hatherton and his family?" "I think I'm going to be sick," Ginger said as she crouched in front of the laptop. "I keep waiting for one of them to come through the door." Ignore the fear, Maggie said, not looking away from the screen. I feel the same kind of panic before every theatre show. That terror that everything will go horribly wrong and it will be all your fault. But the fear is pointless. Ignore it and do what you need to do as fast as you can. Taking a deep breath, Ginger swallowed firmly. A theatre show isn't quite the same as worrying about being murdered. All the social media sites are blocked on this network. So, are messaging apps, she muttered, starting searches for details on the names Hatherton and Hatherton Smythe. You should meet some of the directors I've worked with. They make Hatherton seem nurturing, Maggie replied, a frown twisting her neat mouth. Well, I wasn't expecting that. What? Ginger quickly scrolled through page after page of society gossip articles, looking for something meatier. I don't know if Hatherton has been speaking to us at all, Maggie said slowly, clicking through various files and folders. There's audio software you can use to compile a database of someone's voice. Then you can basically make up whatever sentences you want in that person's voice. I don't think it's a coincidence that Hatherton hasn't been seen in public for 2 years, Ginger said, turning the laptop towards Maggie. His lawyer claims he's still alive and they speak regularly, but he's apparently, and I quote, become a recluse in the country manor in Gloucestershire that he bought 4 years ago. Look up Annabel's name, Maggie said, her face tense. I'll look up mentions of Hatherton or Hatherton Smythe in the news. Way ahead of you. Ginger clicked into a news article dated from 10 years before. Hatherton heiress loses husband in a tragic car crash. Is there a photo? Maggie leaned closer, skim-reading the article. Yep, one of Annabel and her child. Ginger scrolled down a little further. Her breath froze in her throat as a picture of a much younger Annabel, face hollow with grief, stood stiffly beside a teenage boy, the caption identified as her son. I guess we found the family connection, Ginger said hoarsely when she was able to speak again. The young man is Annabel's son, Leo Hatherton Smythe. Chapter 15. Time to go, Maggie said, even though the two of them were still reeling from their discovery. Looks like our actual host has crawled out of the woodwork. She pointed to the monitor still showing the camera feeds. In the kitchen, the smoke was beginning to clear slightly as Leo Hatherton Smythe, the young man Ginger had seen behind the mirror, battled to put out the oil pan fire. We have to shut down the cameras and the audio for the whole house, Ginger said, and try to figure out how to stop those windows from electrocuting us. Maggie began hitting buttons and clicking through programs. I can't figure out how it all connects, she said, and Ginger saw that her hands were beginning to shake. I don't know how to shut it down. It's too complicated. Ginger swore as she saw the young man's head swivel towards the camera. I think you might have broadcast that part, she said softly, backing away from the desk. Oh, crap, Maggie squeaked. On the camera feed, he threw down the fire blanket he was using to smother the fire and ran out of view. No time to do it properly, Ginger said, grabbing at every cable she could reach. Unplug it all. If you can't unplug it, rip it out. The two of them frantically destroyed the computer setup, removing Leo's ability to surveil them. Do you think this'll shut down the windows too? Maggie asked, breathless, as she hurled a monitor across the room. It tore down one of the corkboards with a crash. Ginger couldn't help but grin in satisfaction at the destruction they'd wrought. After everything Leo Hatherton Smythe had done to them, it was the least he deserved. They ran for the door. Hurrying back down the servants' passage, both waved their phones around in search of a signal. Before they could reach the exit back into the empty room, a figure appeared in the doorway, and Ginger got her first proper look at Leo Hatherton Smythe. He looked even younger than she expected. If the article hadn't let her know that he would now be 25, then she wouldn't have put him a day over 20. The boyish looks were spoiled, however, by his sunken eyes and the yellowing teeth he bared at them in a snarl of rage. Call me Sarge, Maggie yelped, because this is no exit. Grabbing Maggie by the arm, Ginger swung them both into one of the even smaller passages. "Where does this go?" Maggie asked, trying to look behind her. "Doesn't matter." Ginger kept urgently pushing the shorter woman ahead of her. "As long as it's away from him." Leo's pursuing roar of rage sent a chill up her spine. This passage was even gloomier than the last. Ginger didn't see the descending stairs ahead until the ground disappeared beneath her feet. With a shriek of shock, both she and Maggie tumbled together into the darkness. The drop wasn't far, but the floor they landed on was stone. Ginger groaned, immediately scrambling to her feet. "He won't be far behind us," she panted, grabbing for Maggie's vague shape. "Come on, we need to get back to the others." Like a little rubber ball, Maggie sprang upright. Scampering back up the 4 stone steps they had fallen down, she slammed shut the door at the top. Fumbling for a lock, she clicked it into place and heaved a sigh of relief. "You think quicker than I do," Ginger praised, rubbing the bruised back of her head. "Now, how do we get out of here?" The door shook as Leo began thunderously pounding on it from the other side. "Stop defying me!" he howled. "You're not supposed to be doing this." His true voice was very different from that of his great-uncle that he'd been borrowing. It was reedy and petulant. "Go die in a hole," Maggie yelled back. Eloquent as always, Ginger grinned, turning on her phone flashlight and looking around the space. "Wow, would you look at that?" she said, unable to believe their luck, as she saw a large fuse box on the opposite wall. "Looks like this whole endeavour is about to lose its spark." There was another round of threats and rage from Leo, but Ginger ignored him. She started flicking any and all switches. One of them had to shut off the power to the deadly window frames, right? Or open the glass door in the entrance hall. Anything. The door stopped shaking. Everything went eerily quiet. "I don't like that," Maggie said, joining Ginger by the fuse box. "That arsling being silent means trouble." Using the heel of her hand to drive one particularly stubborn switch into the off position, Ginger nodded with satisfaction as the low electric hum present in the room was replaced with silence. "I don't know how long it'll hold like that," she said, spotting a second door leading out. "We'd better hurry." Maggie picked up a short length of timber from the floor. She gave a few experimental swings as if it was a cricket bat. "I almost want the little tosser to come within range now," she said, hurrying to follow Ginger back up into the main house. The door took them out into the corridor next to the entrance hall with its impenetrable wall of glass. As she and Maggie ran past, Ginger backtracked to try the door. "No luck," she said after pushing and pulling a few times. "Guess even if there isn't any power, the default is to stay locked." When they reached the stairs, Ginger pulled out the floor plan marking the placement of traps. The last thing she wanted right now was for her or Maggie to end up like Charles. Avoiding the tiles that she could see were trapped, Ginger went crashing through the swing doors into the large kitchen, Maggie right behind her. Smoke still hung in the air, concealing her vision. A prickle of unease made Ginger's fingers twitch. What if Leo had come there to wait for them? Suddenly, a figure burst from the smoke, swinging their weapon with a fierce yell. Ginger screamed. Maggie screamed. Calliope, who was the one attacking, also screamed. She dropped the glass bowl half filled with a cake mix that she'd adapted into a weapon, and it exploded on the stone floor. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as if to make sure her heart was still there. "I thought you were him." "Were you planning to batter him to death?" Maggie asked, using her makeshift club to poke at one of the goop-covered shards on the floor. Ginger groaned and Calliope rolled her eyes. "Hey, puns are a coping mechanism for some people," Maggie responded defensively. "Don't you think we have slightly bigger problems to deal with than judging one of the ways I deal with stress?" "Did you stop him?" Lily asked, poking her head around the pantry door. "Can Susan and I come out now?" "We haven't stopped him," Maggie said, dashing to the kitchen doors, tying them closed by looping a tea towel through the handles. "But we might have slowed him down. See if any of you can call the police, Ginger said, unloading the phones from her apron onto the workstation furthest away from the still smouldering hob that had once been Susan's. You do that, while I see if we can get these windows open. Clambering up onto the metal countertop, Ginger took a deep breath. The sound of Manjeet's body striking the stone floor after he was electrocuted played over and over again in her head, like when the needle was stuck on a record. Isn't the definition of insanity doing the same thing multiple times but expecting the outcome to change? Maggie asked, standing below her. I guess we'll find out, Ginger said. Pass me that stick of yours. Maggie did so. Ginger focused on the feel of the splinters prickling her palm, just in case it was for the last time. She turned her face to the summer sunshine streaming in through the windows, warm and golden as if nothing was amiss. Would this be the final time she felt the sun on her skin? She reached out with the timber, aiming for the exact spot Manjeet had touched. I think I got through to the police, Lily said, waving her phone. The signal kept cutting out, but I think they got most of what I said. Ginger closed her eyes. She thought of her parents, of Colin, of her brother. She pictured Nina and Miles waiting for her at home, no doubt napping on the living room windowsill in the sunshine. She remembered that she'd left a carton of milk out on the counter and wondered if Mr. O'Malley had put it away or if it had gone sour. She thought about her life and how much she wanted to keep living it. The wood touched the window frame and Ginger braced herself for the pain. Chapter 16. There was no pain, no flash of electricity. Ginger's knees briefly felt as if they'd turned to jelly. She wobbled, almost losing her balance. Leaning against the window frame for support, she released the breath she'd been holding. It's off, she said to the women gathered below. For now. But we need to hurry. There could be any number of ways for Leo to get in here. She turned to Maggie. These locks are too advanced for me to pick. Let's see what we can find to either break the lock or the hinges. I already thought of that, Susan said, passing them 2 large brass weights. Just as well that this Leo fellow, whoever he is, gave us old-fashioned scales rather than electric ones. You're a genius, Susan. Pulling Maggie up onto the counter beside her, Ginger took one of the weights and began hammering at the handle. Can someone find me a sugar thermometer or something? When this handle comes off, I'll need something to smash the inside. I've got one at my workstation, Calliope said, picking up the pieces of wood that Ginger had set down and hurrying away. Who is this Leo? Lily asked, dragging a step stool over to the counter so Susan would be able to climb up. How did Hatherton get his claws into him? Did you find out? His name is Leo Hatherton Smythe, Ginger said, ripping off the window handle. He's Annabelle's son and Sir Maxwell's grandnephew. Lost his dad in a car crash about 10 years ago, according to an article we managed to find. Calliope, who had just passed Ginger the sugar thermometer, went pale. Leo Smythe? She asked. And Annabelle was his mother? Oh God, I know him. Ginger forced the thin metal rod into the broken lock, awkwardly feeling out the tumblers. There was a snap, and the window opened with a groan. Fresh air, sweetened with the scent of freshly mown hay, washed over them all. He's the one who caused the car crash that killed my girlfriend, Calliope said shakily, leaning into Susan as the older woman put an arm around her shoulders. They found out he tampered with the brake lines on his father's car. It caused the crash. He went to prison for it. It was meant to be my cow of a mother driving, said a nasal, petulant voice Ginger unfortunately recognised. My gift to her after years of lying about how I came to be born, years of withholding love, but her dumb husband went driving instead. Ruined a perfectly good plan. Ginger locked eyes with Leo Hatherton Smythe, refusing to cringe or react in any way, even when he gave her a broad, sharp-toothed grin. Now, he said, clasping his skinny arms behind his back, where do you, lovely ladies, think you're going? Where's your competitive spirit? It really didn't have to be this way, Leo said, beginning to pace through the smoke-stained kitchen. But Mother just had to take the other car that morning. And you all, he pointed at them in turn, interfered and meddled and spoiled my life in unforgivable ways. So, it stopped being about just her and became about all of you saccharine bakery bores. What could we possibly have done to you? Ginger asked, climbing down off the countertop and placing herself subtly between Lily and Leo. Most of us have never even heard of you. Her face was hot, and she knew her voice was shaking. It felt that if she took one more step, her legs would dissolve like the sponge fingers in tiramisu. But behind her back, she gestured for the other four to begin moving closer to the countertop and prepare to climb out the window. Leo rolled his narrow shoulders and ground his teeth in what looked like a performed attempt at a tick. Pointing at the group, his finger quaked from the force of his rage. That one, he said, pointing to Calliope, couldn't let the crash be quietly recorded as an accident. She had to push and push for them to investigate it. She's the reason I spent the 4 years until I turned 18 in a stupid juvenile prison with therapists and counsellors, like that goth one with pink hair, trying to crawl inside my head. You're the reason the woman I loved is dead, Calliope spat. The reason Nadine, that goth one with the pink hair, is dead. Forgive me if I don't weep at your tale of woe. Leo snarled, his head rolling in a tight circle, fists clenching and unclenching. The cute little Chinese one thought herself too good for a date with me, he hissed, moving on to Lily. Wouldn't even give me a chance. Looks like I dodged a bullet, Lily sneered, climbing up onto the countertop, fire in her eyes. No one cares, sad sack. There's 5 of us, 1 of you, and we're leaving now. Leo took half a step forward, but Calliope mirrored the action, raising the length of timber she still carried. Make my goddamn day, she hissed. I dare you. For the first time, Ginger saw a flicker of fear in Leo's bloodshot blue eyes. There's nowhere you can go, he said, but his smirk was less convincing than before. You can't call anyone. No one knows you're here thanks to your own stupidity. I can't believe you all thought you were actually interesting and talented enough for a reality show. He cackled, and Ginger flushed with furious embarrassment. Flickering a glance back over her shoulders, she allowed herself to feel a moment of relief as she watched Lily safely lower Susan out of the window, the few feet to the ground before following her out. Leaving via a window, Maggie? Leo called, and Ginger immediately tensed. Seems to be a bit of a theme for you. Maggie stepped back from the window. Don't listen to him, Calliope shouted. Don't let him taunt you. I've just always been a big fan of defenestration, Maggie joked weakly, her lower lip wobbling ever so slightly as she tried to keep her fear in check. Leo thrust his other hand out toward her as if something was about to explode from his palm. Considering how insane the whole situation was, Ginger was almost surprised when that didn't happen. But then she saw the skin of his right hand. It was red and ridged with thick scar tissue, as if from a terrible burn. Suddenly, she understood. Chapter 17. It was an accident, Maggie whispered. I didn't mean for you to burn your hand. I swear. You came after me and... Get out the window, Ginger commanded, taking a step back to try and push the other woman into motion. Don't think about any of this. Just go. If that oil was still hot, I'd be tempted to give you the same experience you gave me, Leo snarled, creeping closer. Calliope, who was now on the counter, tossed Ginger the club. Gripping it tightly, Ginger tracked Leo with it even as she began frantically looking around for some other weapon. Calliope disappeared out the window, dragging Maggie closer as she went. Ginger, come on, Maggie said, tears wet on her cheeks. I won't go unless I know you're right behind me. Oh, Leo mocked, coming even nearer. He snatched up a knife off the nearest workstation. So cute that the menace to society is trying to protect her little friend. We're going to go for it together, Maggie, Ginger whispered, knowing that it was now or never. She wasn't ruthless or skilled enough to disarm Leo, so it was all going to be about keeping him at bay. In 3, 2, 1, go! Maggie flung herself out of the window, landing safely in the arms of the others waiting below. Hurling the length of timber at the yowling Leo, Ginger scrambled up on the counter. Before she could climb out to safety, however, Leo latched onto her ankle. With a gasp, Ginger felt herself being pulled backwards. She tried to keep a grip on the window frame, but was forced to let go to keep her balance as Leo dragged her lower body off the counter and onto the floor. Despite how terrifying the situation was, Ginger found, in that moment, that she wasn't afraid. The fear was there, of course it was, but it was silenced by the great, roaring wave of determination which filled her to the brim. She was going home to her cats. God damn it! Rolling out of Leo's reach behind the closest workstation, she leapt to her feet. Let's see you avoid these with the same speed you avoid taking responsibility for your life, she taunted, grabbing several eggs out of a nearby bowl and launching them at Leo. Her aim was true. Several hit him on the chest, staining his pale green plaid button-down with bright yellow yolks. One struck him in the forehead, smearing egg across his eyes. Leo let out a roar of rage, trying to clear his vision. Ginger couldn't help but laugh, skipping along to the next workstation where Susan had left out a mixing bowl half filled with flour. No imagination at all, she yelled, snatching it up. If you were a spice, you'd be salt. She threw the bowl at Leo as he rushed at her, dousing him in flour. It was dangerous to taunt him, but she wanted to draw him away from the window so she could make another dash for it. Grabbing whatever she could reach, Ginger continued to assault the man who had been their captor for the past 2.5 days. By the time she was once again beside the window, Leo was covered from head to foot in a nightmarish mockery of a cake, the flour mixed with the eggs and milk to make a coagulated paste that left him almost blind. Delicate sugar decorations and edible glitter clung to the damp patches. All Ginger cared about, though, was getting out of the window. Leaping up onto the counter for what she hoped was the last time, Ginger was about to grab onto the window frame to pull herself out when she paused. "Ginger!" Maggie shouted, almost within arm's reach. "What are you waiting for? Get out of there! The others are already running down to the drive to flag someone down." But Ginger hesitated, even as Leo stumbled toward the counter, furiously trying to wipe flour and egg from his face. Listening carefully, Ginger jerked back when she heard the low, familiar hum emanating from the metal. "I knew those fuse switches weren't going to stay where they were," she muttered to herself. There was only one thing left to do. As Leo reached for her ankle again, Ginger flung herself out of the window. Like a cat avoiding contact with someone they dislike, she contorted her body away from the frame. Then, she was falling. Ginger tried not to think about the fact that, even though the drop was only 5 or 6 feet, she could still break her neck if she landed on her head. The ground rose up to meet her quickly. Ginger groaned as the air exploded from her lungs from the impact. Something in her wrist popped, but she didn't stop to think about it. Gasping, she struggled to her feet, just in time to see Leo arrive at the window. "Being free of the house doesn't mean you're free of me, Ginger," he sneered. "I can't take him seriously looking like that," Maggie said. "Come on, let's catch up with the others." Spittle flew from Leo's lips as he choked on his own fury. Then, Ginger realised that he was actually choking. He'd made the mistake of gripping the electrified frame with both hands. Soon, Leo fell backward into the kitchen, unmoving. The strange smell of burnt hair and baking cake hung in the air as Ginger heard the first hint of police sirens on the air. "If you fall back inside the building from the window, does that make it a reverse defenestration?" Maggie queried, picking a leaf out of her hair. All at once, realising she was too exhausted to stay upright, Ginger collapsed to sit on the unkempt lawn on this side of the manor. Maggie joined her, resting her elbows on her knees. Ginger turned to look at her friend. I have no idea how we explain all this to the police. Any ideas where we should start? Chapter 18. So I'm kind of notorious in both Greater and Little Chiswick now, Ginger said, lifting her splintered wrist out of the way as Miles wandered across her lap. People either come up to me to ask really intense questions or avoid me altogether. Why do you think I'm hiding in the Philippines for a month? It wasn't just because my ma has been telling me I need to brush up my Tagalog, Maggie said over the video call. No one here has heard anything about it. Not yet, anyway. You're lucky, Ginger grimaced. Your family sends you off on holiday to recover, and mine won't even get things off high shelves for me while my wrist is healing. Maggie took a sip of tea. How much longer do you need to keep it wrapped up for? I know it was dislocated, but it's been a couple of weeks now, right? I've got another few days, Ginger replied, scratching Nina behind the ear, the cat's soft purrs harmonising with the soft jazz on the turntable and the buzzing of the bees in the honeysuckle. I can't wait, she confessed. Starting a new job working in a kitchen at a fancy private school is no fun wearing a splint. If my brother wasn't suspended right now, I'd be asking him to give me a police escort everywhere I go just so I can get on with my life. Maggie winced. I'm not going to ask what he was suspended for, but yikes. That other guy was nice, though. The detective inspector, who was one of the first ones at the manor. D.I. Clementine? Yeah, he's all right, Ginger said. We went to the same secondary school. Does that mean he's giving you inside knowledge on the investigation? Maggie asked, leaning in closer to the screen, eyes bright with interest. They've told me next to nothing. Ginger chewed her lip as she considered whether or not she should share what D.I. Clementine, or Jacob as she knew him when he was off duty, had told her. Did they at least find out anything more about the Hatherton family and what Leo did with Sir Maxwell? Maggie asked. At this, Ginger winced. Yeah, she said slowly. Sir Maxwell was in the house the whole time. Apparently, Leo kind of took him hostage 2 years ago and then spent all that time recording his voice for the database and using Maxwell's money to set the house up for us. Maggie frowned. Where's Sir Maxwell now? He'd been neglected for so long in his wheelchair that by the time the ambulance crew got him to the hospital, he only lasted a few days, Ginger said, focusing on Nina's soft fur so she wouldn't think about the sight of a filthy, hunched Sir Maxwell being wheeled out of the manor house. What a way to treat your great uncle, Maggie said, shaking her head. I know he wasn't the best guy, but that's a tough way for anyone's life to end. Maybe hold your sympathy for a moment longer, Ginger said with a wince. Turns out that Sir Maxwell was, in addition to being Leo's great uncle, also his father. Maggie cocked her head in confusion, then gasped. And Annabelle was his real mother? Ginger nodded. Poor woman. No wonder she got trapped with Maxwell. She was barely an adult herself when she had Leo. But Hatherton cut her, and the child, out of his will. It was something Leo grew up resenting, hating this man who kept him away from wealth he thought he deserved. Maggie shuddered. I don't want to think about it anymore. Have you heard about how any of the others are doing? By the others, she meant the 6 survivors of what the press had dubbed the deadly dinner party, which always made Ginger want to point out that it hadn't been a dinner party at all. There were, however, indeed 6 survivors. As well as the 4 women who had escaped with Ginger, emergency services had discovered that Charles had survived his fall into the basement. It turned out that Charles was a former high school teacher of Leo's, which was the reason he had been a target. He had been very grateful to walk away, or rather be wheeled away with only 2 broken legs, a mild concussion, and dehydration. Lily still likes all my social media posts, Ginger said to finish, and I get an email from Calliope every now and again, but those are usually to warn me about upcoming press stuff. I don't think she wants to stay bosom buddies with any of us, Maggie said, stirring her tea and taking another sip. that I blame her. She got that added trauma of finding out the guy who was trying to kill her was also responsible for killing her girlfriend. Ginger nodded, seeing a shadow of pain fall over Maggie's face. She didn't think it was wise to tell her about the letters from Manjeet, Nadine and Jack's families, thanking her for returning the phones of their loved ones. "When can I expect to see you in my neck of the woods again?" Ginger asked with a certain amount of forced brightness. "Susan and I have all sorts of plans for baking projects. You should join us." She chuckled. "We have an email thread that Susan accidentally keeps adding random people to. It's great." "That does sound excellent," Maggie said. "Add me in, and I'll think about taking part when baking doesn't trigger flashbacks for me, in the charming way it currently does." Although the words were dark, they were said with Maggie's usual dry humour, and so Ginger wasn't overly concerned. "You never told me why he went after you or Susan," Maggie said. "Care to confess your wicked misdeed, Burnet?" Ginger sighed and half laughed. "According to the insane, rambling files he had on all of us that they found in the command room, Susan cut him off in traffic," she said, appreciating Maggie's look of total disbelief as she continued. "And I apparently pissed him off when I was temping as a customer service rep for a bank earlier this year. He called to complain that he was running out of money and I wasn't able to instantly fix that for him." All Maggie could do was roll her eyes and sigh. Then a mischievous twinkle appeared in her eye. "Whatever pun you're about to make," Ginger warned, "don't do it." "I was only going to say we really gave him his just desserts," Maggie said with an air of faux innocence, then immediately burst out laughing. Ginger couldn't help but join in. They said goodbye soon after when Maggie's grandmother came into the room, chattering away in Tagalog and gesturing for Maggie to join her. Ginger closed her laptop and stood still, keeping Nina cradled in one arm. Strolling to the back door, she looked out over the hazy, breezy afternoon. Miles curled around her ankles, meowing questioningly as his sister peered down triumphantly from her premium spot. It was difficult to remember if she had felt as grateful for her life before all that had happened, Ginger reflected. She thought she had been grateful, but now every breath spent in the safety of her home felt like a gift. "Come on, you two," she said to the two felines. "I'll feed you, and then I'm off to dinner with Mum and Colin." Nina scrambled out of Ginger's arms at the promise of food, landing on her brother's tail and sending the two of them rocketing through the house in a mad dash. With her heart so full she thought it might burst, Ginger took a final breath of the honeysuckle air. Life had returned to peace and quiet. She just hoped it would stay that way. The proof is in the pudding story is available on our website and on Amazon. Read the proof is in the pudding now. Click on the image or scan the QR code.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.